somewhere inside the navigation tank, inside the sealed chamber filled with the orange spice gas whose concentration would have killed an unmodified human in minutes, there was a person. There had been a person. The body that floated in the tank's saturated atmosphere had once been a human body, had once walked on a world's surface, had once breathed the ordinary air the human lungs were designed for, had once presented the face and the form the human species biology produced. The body in the tank no longer presented that face. The body in the tank no longer maintained that form. The body in the tank was something the human species biology had not produced, was something the spice's sustained biochemistry had converted the human biology into, was something that existed between the human and the inhuman in the transitional space the transformation occupied. The transformation was not a metaphor. The transformation was biological, was the sustained, progressive, irreversible modification of the human organism's physiology through the biochemical processes the concentrated spice consumption generated. The modification changed the body. The modification changed the consciousness. The modification changed the person. The person who entered the transformation was not the person who emerged from the transformation, if the term emerged could be applied to a process that was not completed but sustained, that was not finished but ongoing, that was not the conversion from one state to another but the perpetual becoming that never reached the final form the becoming was progressing toward. This is the story of that transformation. The story of what happened to the human body and the human consciousness when the spice's biochemistry was applied at the concentrations and the durations the navigational function required. The story of what was lost and what was gained, and whether the gaining justified the losing. The story of the most consequential biological sacrifice the Imperium's institutional architecture demanded of the persons the sacrifice was imposed on. The story is not comfortable. The transformation was not comfortable. The process that converted the human into the navigator was the process whose biological, psychological, and existential dimensions exceeded what the comfortable narrative could encompass. The story requires the discomfort, requires the sustained attention to the transformation's horrifying dimensions that the transformation's significance demands. The transformation began with the spice, the melange, the substance whose biochemical properties included the cognitive enhancement, the longevity extension, and the consciousness expansion the civilization's institutional functions depended on, was the substance that initiated the navigator's biological conversion through the consumption's sustained, concentrated, comprehensive operation. The consumption was not the consumption the ordinary spice users experienced. The ordinary user consumed the spice at the levels the enhancement required, at the concentrations, the longevity extension, and the cognitive improvement the ordinary consumption produced. The ordinary consumption was measured. The ordinary consumption was manageable. The ordinary consumption produced the addiction whose physiological character the sustained consumption established. The navigator's consumption exceeded the ordinary by orders of magnitude. The consumption was not measured in the dietary quantities the ordinary user's consumption was calibrated to. The consumption was measured in the atmospheric saturation, in the concentration of the spice gas the seal tank maintained at the levels the navigational function's prescient perception required. The navigator did not eat the spice. The navigator breathed the spice. The navigator existed in the spice, inhabited the atmosphere the spice's concentration constituted, breathed the air the spice's presence had converted from the breathable medium the human lungs required into the saturated environment the navigational consciousness demanded. The inhabitation was total. The navigator lived in the spice gas. The navigator breathed the spice gas. The navigator's skin absorbed the spice gas. The navigator's biology was immersed in the spice gas at every point the biology's surface encompassed. The immersion was comprehensive, was the complete exposure of the organism to the substance's concentration at every dimension the organism's physiology presented to the environment. The comprehensiveness was the transformations mechanism. The spice's biochemistry, the compounds the substance contained, the reactions the compounds initiated in the biological systems the compounds contacted, operated on every dimension of the navigator's physiology simultaneously. The compounds contacted the respiratory system through the breathing. The compounds contacted the integumentary system through the skin's absorption. The compounds contacted the neural system through the respiratory and the integumentary pathways the absorption provided. The contact was total. The contact was sustained. The contact produced the modification. The modification's first dimension was the eyes. The visual organs, the biological structures the human physiology maintained for the optical perception the vision constituted, were the first structures the spice's sustained saturation modified visibly. The eyes changed colour. The irises that had presented whatever colouring the person's genetics had determined were converted to the blue within blue the spice saturation produced, the deep, luminous blue that replaced the original colouring with the substance's biochemical signature. The blue within blue was the transformation's first visible marker, the indicator the sustained spice consumption produced in the visual organ's pigmentation through the biochemistry the consumption introduced. The marker was present in every sustained consumer, was present in the Fremen whose environmental exposure produced the saturation's effects, was present in the institutional consumers whose dietary consumption maintained the concentrations the enhancement required. The marker was the addiction's signature, the visible evidence of the sustained consumption the addiction constituted. In the navigators, the blue within blue was intensified. The saturation's concentration, the levels that exceeded the ordinary consumption by the orders of magnitude the navigational function required, produced the intensification the ordinary consumer's eyes did not display. The blue was deeper. The luminosity was greater. The visual effect was the saturation's intensification made visible in the organs, the saturation's earliest effects modified. The eyes were the beginning. The eyes were not the transformation's consequential dimension. The eyes were the surface, the visible change the external observation could detect, the marker the casual encounter could register. The consequential changes were deeper, were conducted in the biology's interior dimensions, in the physiology's functional architecture, in the neural system's operational character. The body changed. The statement requires the expansion the transformation's biological scope demands, requires the detailed documentation of what the body's change encompassed and what the change's dimensions constituted. The cranium expanded. The skull, the skeletal structure the human biology maintained for the neural system's protection, was modified by the transformation's sustained operation. The expansion was the neural system's growth's accommodation. The skeletal structure's progressive enlargement to accommodate the neural architecture the transformation's cognitive demands were developing. The neural growth was the transformation's functional dimension, the prescient perception the navigational function required. The consciousness's awareness of the fold space paths the navigation demanded was the perception the neural architecture had to support. The architecture's development, the growth of the neural structures the perception required, the expansion of the neural networks the consciousness's enhanced operations demanded, was the development the cranium's expansion accommodated. The expansion was progressive. The cranium did not expand to the final dimensions in the transformation's initial phases. The expansion progressed across the transformation's sustained operation, grew as the neural architecture developed, expanded as the cognitive demands increased, enlarged as the prescient perception's scope widened. The progression was the transformation's temporal dimension, the ongoing change that the sustained consumption's continued operation generated across the months and years and decades the transformation encompassed. The limbs atrophied, the arms and the legs, the structural elements the human biology maintained for the locomotion and the manipulation the human activities required, were progressively reduced by the transformation's biological operations. The reduction was the disuse's consequence, the biological response, the locomotion's cessation and the manipulation's abandonment produced in the structures the locomotion and the manipulation utilized. The navigators did not walk. The navigators did not use their arms. The navigators existed in the tanks. In the sealed chambers, the navigational function's atmospheric requirements maintained, and the existence in the tanks did not include the walking or the manipulation the limbs were designed for. The non-use produced the atrophy. The atrophy reduced the limbs. The reduction was the transformation's structural consequence. The physical evidence of the activities the transformation's conditions had eliminated. The body's overall form was modified. The human form, the bilateral symmetry, the proportional relationship between the torso and the limbs, the physical configuration the human biology maintained, was progressively altered by the transformation's comprehensive effects. The form was no longer recognizably human in the dimensions the ordinary perception assessed, no longer presented the proportions, the contours, the structural relationships the human form's recognition depended on. The form was becoming something else. Not the form of another known organism, not the conversion to the body plan the biological catalogue's other entries documented. The form was becoming the form the transformation was producing. The configuration the spice's sustained biochemistry and the navigational functions demands were generating in the biology the transformation was operating on. The form was novel, was the biological expression the transformation's conditions had not produced before. Was the configuration the sustained saturation and the functional demands were creating from the human biology's material. The novelty was the transformation's most disturbing physical quality. The body was not becoming another recognized thing. The body was becoming an unrecognized thing, was progressing toward the form no biological precedent encompassed, was developing into the configuration no evolutionary history had produced. The becoming was the horror, was the visual evidence that the person's body was being converted into something the human experience had no reference for, something the biological understanding had no category for, something the perceptual vocabulary had no term for. The skin changed. The integumentary system, the biological covering the human organism, maintained for the environmental protection and the sensory reception the skin's functions encompassed, was modified by the sustained immersion in the spice gas the tank's atmosphere constituted. The skin's texture changed. The surface that had presented the human skin's characteristic qualities, the flexibility, the warmth, the tactile character the human skin's biology produced, was converted to the surface the sustained immersion generated. The conversion was progressive, developed across the transformation's duration, intensified with the immersion's continuation, deepened with the saturation's sustained exposure. The skin's color changed. The pigmentation that had presented the coloring the person's genetics had determined was modified by the spice's biochemical presence in the integumentary system's cellular architecture. The modification was comprehensive, encompassed the skin's entire surface, affected the coloring's every dimension, converted the appearance's every element the pigmentation contributed to. The changes were the transformation's envelope, the surface modification that encompassed the deeper modifications the transformation's interior operations were producing. The surface reflected the interior, showed the biological changes the sustained saturation was generating in the form the exterior presentation could display. The surface was the transformation's visible dimension. The interior was the transformation's functional dimension. The visible and the functional were both the transformation's products, were both generated by the sustained consumption's comprehensive operation on the biology the consumption was applied to. The consciousness changed more than the body. This statement, which might seem to privilege the psychological over the biological, was the statement the transformation's full examination supported. The body's changes were dramatic. The consciousness's changes were more dramatic. The body was modified. The consciousness was transformed. The modification and the transformation were different degrees of the same process. The biological change the sustained consumption produced, and the consciousness's degree exceeded the body's degree by the margin the navigational function's cognitive demands imposed. The prescient perception was the consciousness's transformation's most consequential product. The awareness of the fold space paths, the perception of the probability space's navigational dimension that the safe travel through fold space required, was the capability the transformation's cognitive effects produced. The perception was not ordinary consciousness. The perception was not the heightened awareness the moderate spice consumption generated, was not the cognitive enhancement the dietary consumption produced in the ordinary consumer. The perception was the altered consciousness, the mode of awareness the sustained saturation's biochemistry produced in the neural architecture the saturation's growth had developed. The altered consciousness perceived differently. The ordinary consciousness perceived the present, perceived the immediate environment through the sensory channels the biology provided, perceived the world through the data the senses collected. The navigational consciousness perceived the probable, perceived the futures the probability space contained, perceived the paths the fold space travel's safe passage required. The perception of the probable was the consciousness's most consequential alteration. The consciousness that perceived the probable did not perceive the present in the way the ordinary consciousness perceived the present. The perception's orientation was shifted, was directed toward the futures rather than toward the present, was focused on the paths rather than on the environment, was calibrated to the probability space rather than to the physical space. The shift was the transformation's cognitive cost. The consciousness that perceived the probable with the clarity the navigation required was the consciousness that perceived the present with the reduced engagement the shift produced. The present was not absent, was not eliminated from the consciousness's awareness by the shift's reorientation. The present was diminished, was reduced in the consciousness's perceptual priority by the probable's expanded presence. The diminishment was the person's experience of the transformation. The person inside the navigational consciousness, the person whose awareness the transformation had altered, experienced the present's diminishment as the personal cost the navigational function's cognitive demands imposed. The world was less vivid. The environment was less present. The immediate was less compelling. The person's engagement with the ordinary reality was reduced by the engagement with the navigational reality the transformation had produced. The reduction was the person's loss. The person who could perceive the full space paths with the clarity the safe navigation required was the person who could not perceive the ordinary world with the engagement the ordinary experience provided. The capability and the loss were connected, were the two dimensions of the same alteration, the two consequences of the same shift, the two products of the same transformation. The tank was the navigator's world. The sealed chamber, the engineered enclosure whose atmospheric conditions maintained the spice gas concentration the navigational function required, was the environment the navigator inhabited for the remainder of the navigator's existence after the transformation's initiation. The tank was designed for the function rather than for the person. The chamber's engineering specifications were calibrated to the navigational consciousness's requirements, to the atmospheric concentration, the temperature, the pressure, conditions, the prescient perception's sustained operation demanded. The specifications were not calibrated to the person's comfort, were not designed for the human experience the person inside the tank might have preferred if the preference's expression had been part of the design's considerations. The non-calibration to the person was the tank's most consequential design quality. The tank served the function. The tank did not serve the person. The function and the person coexisted in the same body, were both present in the organism the tank contained, but the tank's design addressed the function while the person's needs were accommodated only insofar as the person's survival was necessary for the function's continuation. The survival was necessary. The navigational consciousness, the prescient perception the function required, was the consciousness the person's biology sustained. The biology had to be maintained for the consciousness to operate. The tank maintained the biology. The maintenance was the tank's secondary purpose, was the requirement the function's dependency on the biology imposed on the tank's design. The maintenance was minimal. The tank provided the atmospheric conditions the biology required, provided the gas mixture the respiratory system processed, provided the temperature the physiology tolerated, provided the pressure the organism's biology could sustain. The provision was calibrated to the biology's minimum requirements rather than to the biology's optimal conditions. The minimum was sufficient for the survival. The minimum was not sufficient for the comfort. The insufficiency was the maintenance's character, the quality that made the tank's provision the functional minimum rather than the personal optimum. The character reflected the design's priorities, the function over the person, the navigation over the navigator, the consciousness's operation over the consciousness's possessor's experience. The isolation was the tank's most devastating personal quality. The navigator inside the tank was isolated, was separated from the human social environment the human consciousness's psychological health depended on, was removed from the interpersonal contact the human experience's emotional dimension required. The isolation was physical. The tank's sealed character, the enclosure's atmospheric integrity that maintained the spice gas concentration the function required, prevented the direct physical contact the human social interaction's most fundamental mode encompassed. The navigator could not touch another person. The navigator could not be touched by another person. The physical separation was the atmospheric requirement's consequence, was the product of the concentration's maintenance that the function's operation demanded. The isolation was also communicative. The navigator's consciousness, altered by the transformation's cognitive effects, oriented toward the probable rather than the present, communicated differently from the ordinary consciousness. The communication was conducted through the modes the altered consciousness's perceptual orientation produced, through the utterances the navigational awareness generated, rather than through the conversational exchanges the ordinary social interaction encompassed. The communication's altered character reduced the navigator's social engagement. The persons who interacted with the navigator, the guild administrators, the institutional functionaries, the governance personnel the guild's operations brought into contact with the navigation tanks, interacted with a consciousness whose altered communication the transformation had produced. The interactions were functional rather than personal, were conducted for the institutional purposes the interactions served, rather than for the social connection the personal interaction would have provided. The functional character was the isolation's institutional dimension. The navigator was isolated not only by the tank's physical separation, but by the communication's functional character, by the reduction of the interpersonal contact to the institutional purposes service, rather than to the personal connection's provision. The dual isolation, the physical and the communicative, was the transformation's social cost. The person inside the navigator's consciousness was isolated from the human social environment in the dimensions the consciousness's psychological health required the environment to address. The isolation was sustained across the transformation's duration. Across the years and the decades the navigational functions operation encompassed. The sustained isolation produced the sustained psychological cost, the ongoing deficit the social environment's absence imposed on the consciousness's personal dimension. The institutional process of becoming a navigator was the process the Guild's organizational apparatus administered for the selection, the preparation, and the initiation of the persons the navigational function's requirements identified as the candidates the function's demands could be applied to. The selection was the process's first phase. The Guild identified the candidates, identified the persons whose genetic configurations and whose physiological profiles the navigational function's requirements specified as the configurations and the profiles the transformation could be successfully applied to. The identification was institutional, was conducted through the assessment apparatus the Guild's organizational operations maintained for the selection's purposes. The assessment was comprehensive. The candidates' genetics were evaluated, were analyzed for the configurations the prescient perception's activation required, were assessed for the potential the spice's biochemistry could develop into the navigational consciousness the function demanded. The candidate's physiology was evaluated, was examined for the resilience the transformation's biological demands would impose, was assessed for the durability the sustained saturation's biochemical effects would require. Not every candidate succeeded. The transformation's initiation, the introduction of the candidate to the spice concentrations the navigational consciousness's development required, was the process whose outcome was not guaranteed by the selection's assessment. The assessment identified the potential. The initiation tested the potential. The testing's outcome was the transformation's success or the transformation's failure. The failure was death. The candidate whose biology could not sustain the transformation's demands, whose physiology could not accommodate the spice concentrations the navigational consciousness's development required, was the candidate whose failure was the biological crisis the concentrations produced. The crisis was lethal. The failure was terminal. The candidate who failed the initiation died. The lethality was the selection's ultimate filter. The institutional assessment identified the candidates the assessment's criteria specified as the candidates most likely to survive. The initiation tested the criteria. The candidates who survived confirmed the criteria. The candidates who died demonstrated the criteria's limitations. The mortality rate, the proportion of the initiated candidates whose initiations produced the failure rather than the success, was the institutional process's most consequential statistic. The rate was not publicly documented, was maintained within the Guild's institutional records with the confidentiality the Guild's operational secrecy applied to the navigational function's institutional details. The rate was present in the institutional knowledge, was known to the administrators whose management of the selection process the rate's assessment informed. The rate was significant. The transformation's demands, the biological requirements, the sustained saturation imposed on the organism the saturation was applied to, exceeded what a substantial proportion of the selected candidates could sustain. The significance was the rate's most consequential quality, the quality that made the transformation's initiation a process whose outcome included the meaningful probability of the death the failure produced. The meaningful probability was the transformation's personal dimension's most consequential pre-initiation element. The candidate who entered the initiation, who accepted the transformation's process as the institutional purpose the candidate's participation served, entered the process with the awareness that the process might kill the candidate rather than transform the candidate. The awareness was the risk's personal experience, the candidate's knowledge that the initiation's outcome included the possibility the knowledge's content described. The acceptance of the risk was the candidacy's most consequential personal decision. The person who accepted the candidacy, who agreed to the initiation's process despite the awareness of the process's possible lethality, was the person who valued the navigational function's service more than the person valued the certainty of the person's survival. The valuation was the decision's content, was the assessment that the function's service justified the survival's risk. The preparation was the process's second phase. The candidates who were selected, whose genetics and whose physiology the assessment had identified as the profiles the transformation could be successfully applied to, were prepared for the initiation the transformation's process encompassed. The preparation included the gradual exposure. The candidates were introduced to the spice at concentrations that exceeded the ordinary consumption's levels, but that did not reach the navigational function's concentrations. The gradual introduction was the preparation's mechanism, the process through which the biology's response to the spice's biochemistry was developed incrementally rather than imposed suddenly. The incrementality was the preparation's most consequential quality. The biology that was introduced to the spice gradually, that developed the biochemical responses the spice's compounds generated through the incremental exposure the preparation provided, was the biology that developed the tolerance the navigational concentrations required. The tolerance was the preparation's product, was the biological capability the gradual exposure developed for the concentrations the initiation would impose. The preparation also included the cognitive training. The candidates received the instruction the navigational function's cognitive demands encompassed, the education in the probability space's perception, the training in the fold space path's identification, the development of the cognitive skills the navigational consciousness would require. The cognitive training was conducted before the transformation's full effects were present, was conducted while the candidate's consciousness still operated in the ordinary mode the pre-transformation awareness encompassed. The training's content was theoretical, was the instruction in the perception the candidates had not yet experienced, was the education in the awareness the transformation had not yet produced. The theoretical character was the training's limitation. The candidates could be instructed in the perception they would eventually experience. The candidates could not practice the perception before the transformation produced the perception. The training prepared the candidate's understanding, The training could not prepare the candidate's experience. The understanding and the experience were different dimensions of the navigational function's capability. The understanding was the knowledge of what the perception would be. The experience was the perception itself. The gap between the understanding and the experience was the preparation's most consequential limitation. The candidates who entered the initiation understood what the perception would be. The candidates did not experience what the perception would be until the initiation's process produced the perception. The gap was the initiation's unknown dimension, the dimension the preparation could describe but could not provide. The initiation was the process's third phase, the phase in which the transformation was fully activated and the candidate's biology was committed to the conversion the sustained saturation's biochemistry would produce. The initiation was the immersion. The candidate was placed in the tank, was introduced to the atmospheric conditions the navigational function's concentrations required, was exposed to the spice gas at the levels the transformation's full activation demanded. The placement was the commitment, the moment at which the candidate's biology was subjected to the concentrations the transformation's sustained operation would maintain. The commitment was irreversible. The biology that was exposed to the navigational concentrations, that was subjected to the spice gas at the levels the transformation required, was the biology that could not be restored to the pre-exposure condition. The biochemical modifications the concentrations produced were modifications the biology could not reverse. The commitment was permanent. The permanence was the commitment's most consequential quality. The permanence meant the candidate could not change the candidate's mind. The person who was placed in the tank, who was exposed to the concentrations the transformation's activation required, was the person who could not subsequently decide the transformation was not desired. The decision was made at the initiation. The decision was permanent. The person who accepted the initiation accepted the permanence the initiation imposed. The permanence was the transformation's most consequential ethical dimension. The decision that was permanent, that could not be reversed, that committed the person to the condition the transformation would produce, was the decision whose ethical character depended on the decision's informedness, the decision's voluntariness, and the decision's comprehension of the permanence the decision entailed. The informedness was partial. The candidates were informed about the transformation's general character, were told what the transformation would produce in the dimensions the institutional knowledge encompassed. The candidates were not informed about the transformation's full experiential content, were not told what the consciousness's alteration would feel like, what the body's modification would experience as, what the person's loss of the ordinary human experience would constitute. The partiality was the institutional process's most consequential ethical limitation. The persons who made the permanent decision made the decision with the partial information, with the knowledge the institutional process provided, rather than with the experience the transformations process would generate. The decision was informed. The decision was not comprehensively informed. The distinction between the informed and the comprehensively informed was the distinction the ethical assessment's evaluation encompassed. The transformation's psychological dimensions were the dimensions the biological account did not encompass, the dimensions that described what the transformation felt like from the inside, what the consciousness experienced as the transformation progressed, what the person underwent as the person's awareness was converted from the ordinary mode to the navigational mode. The experience was the dissolution. The person's ordinary consciousness, the awareness that had operated through the ordinary perceptual modes the pre-transformation biology maintained, was progressively dissolved by the transformation's cognitive effects. The dissolution was not the elimination, was not the consciousness's destruction through the transformation's operation. The dissolution was the conversion, the progressive replacement of the ordinary awareness with the navigational awareness the transformation produced. The conversion felt like the loss. The person whose ordinary consciousness was being converted experienced the conversion as the ordinary consciousness's dissolution rather than as the navigational consciousness's emergence. The experience was the loss because the person's self, the identity the ordinary consciousness sustained, was the self the dissolution was operating on. The person experienced the self's dissolution. The person did not experience the navigational consciousness's construction, could not perceive the construction from the perspective the construction was building, because the perspective was being built. The loss was the transformation's psychological cost. The cost was the self's dissolution, the progressive replacement of the identity the person had maintained with the identity the transformation was producing. The replacement was the cost, because the replacement was the person's loss of the person had been. The loss was sustained. The transformation's progressive character, the ongoing, sustained operation the transformation constituted, meant the loss was ongoing and sustained. The person did not lose the self in a single moment. The person lost the self progressively, experienced the dissolution's incremental operation across the transformation's temporal extent, felt the identity's progressive replacement across the weeks and the months the transformation's initiation encompassed. The progressive character made the loss more rather than less distressing. The sudden loss, the immediate elimination of the self the sudden crisis might have produced, would have been the loss without the awareness. The progressive loss was the loss with the awareness, the sustained experience of the self's dissolution through the incremental operation the awareness could track. The person could feel the self dissolving. The person could perceive the dissolution's progress. The perception was the distress, was the sustained awareness of the loss the perception encompassed. The distress was the transformation's psychological horror. The horror was not the body's modification, was not the physical changes the sustained saturation produced in the organism the saturation was applied to. The horror was the self's dissolution, was the person's sustained experience of the identity's progressive replacement through the transformation's cognitive effects. The body's changes were dramatic. The self's dissolution was devastating. The dramatic and the devastating were different qualities. The dramatic was the visual impact. The devastating was the experiential impact. The navigational function was the purpose the transformation served. The capability the transformation's biological and psychological costs were incurred to produce. Examining the function reveals what the transformation purchased, and whether the purchase's price was justified by the purchase's product. The function was the safe guidance of ships through full space. The interstellar travel the Imperium's civilization depended on, the movement of ships across the distances the interstellar geography encompassed, was conducted through the fold space technology the Holtzman effects engineering provided. The technology folded space, compressed the distances the conventional travel could not bridge into the traversable intervals the folded geometry created. The folding was dangerous. The fold space travel without the guidance, without the navigational awareness of the paths the folded geometry's safe traversal required, was the travel whose probability of success was insufficient for the civilization's transportation needs. The ships that travelled without the guidance were the ships whose survival was contingent on the probability the unguided traversal offered. The probability was low. The survival was uncertain. The uncertainty was the unguided travel's most consequential quality. The guidance was the navigator's contribution. The prescient perception the transformation produced, the consciousness's awareness of the probability space's navigational dimension, was the perception that identified the safe paths through the folded geometry. The identification made the travel safe, converted the uncertain traversal into the guided passage whose success the prescient perception's reliability sustained. The identification operated through the perception of the probable futures. The navigator's consciousness, altered by the transformation's cognitive effects, oriented toward the probable rather than the present, perceived the probability space's navigational content. The perception showed the paths, showed the routes the safe traversal could follow, showed the dangers the unsafe routes encompassed, showed the probabilities the different paths traversals would generate. The showing was not the computation. The navigator did not calculate the paths, did not process the navigational data through the algorithmic operations the computational analysis would have employed. The navigator perceived the paths, apprehended the probability space's navigational content through the direct awareness the prescient consciousness provided. The perception was immediate, was the consciousness's direct encounter with the probability space's structure rather than the consciousness's analytical processing of the structure's data. The immediacy was the perception's most consequential quality for the navigation's function. The immediate perception, the direct awareness the prescient consciousness provided, was the perception the navigational function's timing requirements demanded. The fold space travel's dynamics required the guidance in the intervals the travel's geometry's traversal encompassed. The intervals were brief. The perception had to operate within the intervals. The immediacy permitted the operation. The computation might not have. The might was the conditional that the Ixian navigation machine's development would eventually test. The uncertainty about whether the computational approach could match the prescient perception's immediacy in the navigation's operational requirements. The uncertainty was not resolved during the saga's documented timeline. The uncertainty remained was the open question the navigational technology's development would address in the future the saga's documentation did not encompass. The navigator's prescient perception operated alongside the prescient perceptions the other prescient consciousnesses the Imperium encompassed maintained, operated in the probability space's shared dimension alongside the Kwisatz Haderach's perception and the other prescient awarenesses the spice's biochemistry had activated. The interaction between the prescient perceptions was the interaction the saga documented through the prescient interference the navigator's presence produced. The navigator's prescient fields, the prescient awareness the navigator's consciousnesses maintained, interacted with the other prescient consciousnesses' perceptions in ways that produced the interference the interaction generated. The interference was the navigator's most consequential non-navigational capability. The interference, the disruption of the other prescient consciousness's perceptual clarity the navigator's prescient fields produced, was the capability the Guild's political operations exploited for the institutional purposes the capability served. Edric was the interference's most documented demonstration. The Guild Navigator, whose participation in the Dune Messiah conspiracy was motivated by the Guild's institutional interest in the spice supplies management, whose prescient field provided the conspiracy's tactical concealment against Paul's prescient awareness, was the Navigator whose interference capability the conspiracy's design exploited for the concealment the conspiracy required. Edric's prescient field blurred Paul's perception. The navigator's prescient awareness, operating in the probability space alongside Paul's prescient perception, produced the interference that reduced the clarity of Paul's perception in the dimensions the navigator's field encompassed. The reduction was not the elimination. Paul could perceive the conspiracy's existence without perceiving the conspiracy's operational details. The reduction was the blurring, the decrease in the perceptual clarity that prevented the comprehensive awareness the operational details perception would have required. The blurring was sufficient. The conspiracy did not need to be invisible. The conspiracy needed to be blurred, needed to operate behind the reduced clarity the interference produced, needed to maintain the operational details concealment within the blurring's perceptual limitations. The blurring was sufficient for the concealment. The concealment was sufficient for the conspiracy. Edric's participation demonstrated the navigator's political value beyond the navigational function. The navigator, whose primary institutional purpose was the fold space guidance, whose transformation had been conducted for the navigational capability the transformation produced, was the navigator whose prescient interference provided the political capability the institutional purpose did not encompass. The political value was the secondary capability, the additional utility the prescient field generated alongside the navigational utility the prescient perception's primary orientation provided. The secondary capability's political significance exceeded the primary capability's navigational significance in the conspiracy's dimension. The navigation guided the ships. The interference concealed the conspiracy. The guidance was the ongoing operational function. The interference was the political instrument. The instrument's deployment in the conspiracy was the capability's most politically consequential application, the use of the navigator's prescient field for the political purpose the field's characteristics permitted. Edric's experience of the conspiracy was the experience the altered consciousness produced in the person the institutional participation encompassed. Edric existed in the tank, inhabited the sealed chamber the navigational function's atmospheric requirements maintained, experienced the environment the tank's conditions provided. Edric participated in the conspiracy from the tank, engaged with the conspiracy's institutional dimension through the communication the altered consciousness's modes permitted. The participation was institutional rather than personal. Edric's motivation was the Guild's motivation, the institutional interest in the spice supplies management the Guild's survival depended on. Edric did not participate because of personal grievance. Edric participated because the Guild's assessment concluded that the participation served the Guild's interests. The assessment was the institution's. The participation was the institution's representatives. The representative's personal experience of the conspiracy was the experience the altered consciousness shaped. Edric perceived the conspiracy's dynamics through the prescient perception, through the awareness of the probability space's content the navigational consciousness provided. The perception included the conspiracy's probable outcomes, included the futures the conspiracy's operations might produce, included the consequences the conspiracy's success or failure might generate. The perception was the navigator's contribution alongside the interference. The navigator, who could perceive the probable futures, could assess the conspiracy's prospects, could evaluate the outcomes the conspiracy's operations might generate, could inform the conspiracy's planning with the assessment the probable futures perception provided. The contribution was analytical, was the assessment the prescient perception's content informed, was the evaluation the probability space's navigational dimension supported. The navigator's physical presence in the saga's documented events was the presence the transformation's biological effects produced in the narrative's visual dimension. The descriptions that documented what the navigators looked like and what the navigator's appearance communicated to the persons who encountered the appearance. The navigators were encountered rarely. The Guild's institutional secrecy, the operational confidentiality the Guild maintained around the navigational function's institutional details, included the navigator's physical concealment from the observation the institutional secrecy's maintenance required. The navigators were not displayed, the navigators were not exhibited. The navigators were maintained within the Guild's institutional spaces, within the tanks the navigational function's atmospheric requirements provided, within the facilities the Guild's organizational operations encompassed. The concealment was deliberate. The Guild's institutional assessment concluded that the navigator's physical appearance, the transformation's biological effects' visible expression, would produce the response the institutional reputation's management could not accommodate. The response would be horror. The horror would be the institutional reputation's cost. The cost would be the concealment's absence's consequence. The concealment maintained the mystery. The persons who did not encounter the navigators, who did not observe the transformation's biological effects' visible expression, maintained the uncertainty the concealment sustained. The uncertainty included the speculation, the imagined presentations, the uncertainty's absence of information generated in the consciousness the uncertainty encompassed. The speculation was diverse, ranged from the presentations that approximated the transformation's actual effects to the presentations that exceeded or fell short of the actual effects' dimensions. The uncertainty served the Guild, the institution whose most consequential personnel were hidden from the observation, whose navigator's physical condition was concealed behind the institutional secrecy's operational barriers, was the institution whose mystique the concealment sustained. The mystique was the uncertainty's product, was generated by the not knowing the concealment maintained, was sustained by the speculation the not knowing produced. The mystique served the Guild's political purposes. The institution whose navigator's condition was unknown was the institution whose capabilities were also unknown, whose limits were unassessed, whose vulnerabilities were unidentified, whose strengths were unmeasured. The not knowing encompassed the navigator's condition and the navigator's capabilities simultaneously. The comprehensive not knowing was the mystique's content, the sustained uncertainty about every dimension of the navigational function the concealment encompassed. The concealment's occasional breaches, the moments at which the navigator's appearance was revealed to the observers the institutional secrecy's maintenance had not prepared, were the moments the saga documented with the attention the breach's significance required. The revelations were dramatic, were the encounters between the observer's expectations and the transformation's actual effects. The confrontations between the imagined presentations the speculation had produced and the actual presentations the biology had generated. The confrontations were disturbing. The observers who encountered the navigator's appearance, who perceived the transformation's biological effects' visible expression for the observation the encounter provided, were disturbed by the encounter. The disturbance was the gap's product, the gap between the human form the observers expected and the transformed form the observation revealed. The gap was the transformation's social consequence. The persons who were transformed into the navigators were the persons whose physical form had progressed beyond the recognition the human form's categories encompassed. The progression was the gap, was the distance the transformation had placed between the navigator's appearance and the human appearance the social recognition depended on. The distance was the disturbance's source, was the condition that produced the emotional response the encounter generated in the observers the encounter encompassed. The navigators' relationship with their own transformation was the relationship the saga's documentation suggested but did not fully describe, the relationship between the persons whose biology and whose consciousness the transformation had modified and the modification the transformation constituted. The relationship was complex. The navigators did not simply endure the transformation, did not simply sustain the modification's effects as the passive recipients the modification was applied to. The navigators inhabited the transformation, were the persons whose existence was conducted within the conditions the modification had produced, whose awareness was maintained in the mode the alteration had generated, whose experience was constituted by the dimensions the transformation encompassed. The inhabitation was the relationship's character, the quality that made the navigator's engagement with the transformation the engagement of the inhabitants rather than the engagement of the victims. The navigators were not victims of the transformation. The navigators were the transformation's inhabitants, were the persons whose existence was the transformation's condition, whose awareness was the transformation's mode, whose experience was the transformation's content. The inhabitation's character was neither positive nor negative in the assessment the observer's categories would have applied. The navigator's experience of the transformation was the experience the observer's categories could not encompass, was the experience of the condition the ordinary consciousness had no reference for, was the awareness of the mode the ordinary perception had no precedent for. The non-reference was the relationship's most consequential quality. The navigator's experience of the transformation could not be communicated to the persons whose consciousness operated in the ordinary mode, could not be described in the terms the ordinary consciousness's vocabulary provided, could not be rendered in the categories the ordinary perception's framework encompassed. The experience was incommensurable, was the experience whose quality exceeded the communication's capacity, whose character exceeded the description's reach. The incommensurability was the transformation's isolation's deepest dimension. The navigators were isolated not only by the tank's physical separation and the communication's functional character, were isolated by the experience's incommensurability, by the consciousness's alteration's incommunicable quality, by the condition's character that the ordinary consciousness's language could not describe. The deepest isolation was the experiential isolation, the condition of the consciousness whose experience could not be shared because the experience's character exceeded the sharing's communicative capacity. The physical isolation separated the body. The communicative isolation separated the interaction. The experiential isolation separated the consciousness. The three isolations combined to produce the comprehensive separation the navigator's condition constituted. The navigator's presence across the saga's documented timeline was the presence of the transformation sustained across the millennia the documentation encompassed, the ongoing condition of the persons whose biology and whose consciousness the transformation's sustained operation was maintaining in the modified state the navigational function required. In the Corino era, the 10,000-year governance the dynasty maintained before Paul's revolution, the navigators were the institutional constant. The Guild's navigational service was maintained across the dynasty's duration through the navigators whose transformation the service depended on. The navigators guided the ships. The ships connected the worlds. The worlds constituted the civilization. The civilization depended on the navigation. The navigation depended on the navigators. The navigators depended on the transformation. The dependency chain ran from the civilization, through the navigation, through the navigators, through the transformation through the spice. Every link was necessary. Every link's disruption would have disrupted the subsequent links. The chain's structure was the civilization's structural vulnerability, the architecture of dependencies whose sequential character made the civilization contingent on the chain's weakest link. The navigators were not the weakest link. The navigators were the most resilient link, were the persons whose sustained transformation the Guild's institutional management maintained with the reliability the navigational service's continuation required. The Guild managed the navigators with the institutional attention the management's consequentiality demanded, maintained the tanks, managed the spice supply, administered the institutional operations the navigators' condition required. The management was the Guild's most consequential institutional function. The management of the navigators, the sustained provision of the conditions the transformation's maintenance required, was the function the Guild's institutional existence was organized around. The Guild existed to manage the navigation. The navigation existed through the navigators. The navigators existed through the transformation. The transformation existed through the management. The management's duration, the sustained operation across the 10,000-year Carino era, was the management's most consequential quality. The Guild maintained the navigators across the millennia. The maintenance was sustained. The sustainability was the management's achievement. The demonstration that the institutional management could maintain the transformation's conditions across the timescales the civilization's navigational needs encompassed. In Paul's era, the navigator's condition was unchanged. The transformation that had produced the navigational consciousness, the biological and the psychological modification the sustained saturation had generated, was the condition the navigators maintained through the political transition Paul's revolution constituted. The revolution changed the governance. The revolution did not change the navigators. The political transformation that replaced the Carino dynasty with the Atreides governance did not modify the biological transformation the navigators' condition constituted. The navigators' tanks maintained the atmospheric conditions. The navigators' biology maintained the modified state. The navigators' consciousness maintained the navigational awareness. The maintenance was unaffected by the political change. The unaffectedness demonstrated the transformation's independence from the politics. The biological condition the transformation constituted was independent of the political conditions the governance maintained. The biology operated regardless of the politics. The transformation persisted regardless of the governance. The persistence was the biology's quality. The quality that made the biological condition more durable than the political arrangement the condition coexisted with. Paul's prescient awareness included the awareness of the navigator's condition. The Kwisatz Haderach's perception of the probability space, the comprehensive awareness the prescient consciousness encompassed, included the perception of the navigator's transformation's character. Paul could perceive what the navigators had become, could see the biological modification, the psychological alteration, the existential condition the transformation constituted. The perception was the empathy's source. Paul, the person whose prescient consciousness could perceive the transformation's full character, could perceive the navigator's condition with the awareness the full perception provided. The awareness included the suffering, included the perception of the transformation's personal costs, the losses the modification imposed, the isolation the condition sustained. The empathy was the prescient consciousness's response to the transformation's perception. The consciousness that could perceive the suffering could not prevent the suffering, could perceive the navigator's condition's personal costs without the capacity to address the costs the perception encompassed. The empathy was the perception without the remedy, the awareness without the action, the understanding without the intervention. In the God Emperor's era, the navigator's condition was managed alongside every other dimension of the civilization's institutional landscape the God Emperor's comprehensive governance encompassed. Leto Tekund managed the guild. The comprehensive governance, the 3,500-year management the God Emperor's authority administered, included the guild's institutional operations in the governance's managed dimensions. The management included the navigators, included the transformation's conditions, the spice supplies provision, the institutional operations the navigator's maintenance required. The management was informed by the God Emperor's unique understanding. Leto, the consciousness that inhabited the hybrid body the Santrout symbiosis was producing, understood the transformation from the perspective the hybrid condition provided. The God Emperor was undergoing a transformation. The navigators were undergoing a transformation. The two transformations were different in their mechanisms and their products. The two transformations were similar in their experiential character, in the loss of the human form, the alteration of the consciousness, the progressive becoming of something the human experience had no precedent for. The similarity was the understanding source. The God Emperor, who was becoming the sandworm, understood the navigators who had become something the human form's categories could not encompass. The understanding was the experiential parallel, the comprehension that the shared experience of the biological transformation provided despite the transformation's different mechanisms and products. The God Emperor managed the spice supply the navigators consumed. The management was personal, was conducted through the God Emperor's authority rather than through the institutional mechanisms the CHOAM framework's commercial infrastructure provided. The personal management determined the supply's availability, determined the concentrations the navigator's tanks maintained, determined the conditions the transformation's continuation required. The determination was the power. The God Emperor, who controlled the spice, controlled the navigators, controlled the biological input the transformation depended on, determined the conditions the transformation's maintenance required. The control was the leverage, the mechanism through which the God Emperor's authority was exercised over the guild's institutional operations through the navigator's biological dependency. The leverage was the dependency's exploitation. The navigator's dependency on the spice, the biological requirement the addiction constituted, was the dependency the God Emperor's control of the supply exploited for the governance's purposes. The exploitation was the governance philosophy's expression in the navigational dimension, the use of the biological dependency as the mechanism through which the governance's authority was exercised over the institution the dependency encompassed. In the post-God Emperor era, the navigator's condition was affected by the famine time spice shortage, was impacted by the supply's reduction that the ecological transition the God Emperor's death generated. The shortage reduced the supply. The spice that the navigator's tanks required for the atmospheric conditions the transformation's maintenance demanded was the spice whose availability the shortage reduced. The reduction affected the navigators, affected the atmospheric concentrations the tanks maintained, affected the biological conditions the transformation's sustained operation required. The effects were the shortage's most consequential navigational dimension. The navigators, whose atmospheric conditions were reduced, whose tanks' concentrations were lowered by the supply's diminished availability, were the navigators whose navigational capability was affected by the reduction's biological consequences. The reduced concentrations produced the reduced capability. The reduced capability affected the navigational service. The affected service reduced the interstellar connections the navigation maintained. The reduction cascaded. The navigational capabilities reduction reduced the connections. The connections reduction reduced the commerce. The commerce's reduction reduced the civilization's economic activity. The economic reduction affected the civilization's institutional operations. The cascade ran from the navigators through the navigation, through the connections, through the commerce, through the civilization, each reduction producing the subsequent reduction through the dependency the cascade sequence reflected. The cascade was the civilization's structural vulnerability demonstrated, the demonstration that the dependency chain's disruption at the navigational link produced the consequences the chain's subsequent links encompassed. The disruption at the navigator's condition produced the consequences at the civilization's functioning. The production was the vulnerability, was the chain's sequential character expressed in the consequences the disruption generated. The recovery was gradual. The spice supply's restoration, driven by the sandworm ecology's regeneration from the god emperor's dispersed sand trout, progressively restored the conditions the navigator's atmospheric requirements demanded. The restoration was biological, was conducted at the pace the ecological regeneration's biology determined, rather than at the pace the civilization's navigational needs required. The pace's mismatch, the biology's gradual timeline versus the civilization's immediate needs, was the recovery's most consequential quality for the navigational service's restoration. The service recovered at the biology's pace. The civilization needed the service at the civilization's pace. The mismatch was the gap, the temporal distance between the supply's gradual restoration and the demand's immediate requirements. The transformation's relationship to the prohibition against artificial intelligence was the relationship that connected the navigator's biological condition to the civilization's foundational cognitive decision. The decision that the cognitive functions should be provided through biological means rather than through artificial means. The prohibition said, no machines in the likeness of human minds. The navigation was a cognitive function. The prohibition said, the navigation should be provided through biological means. The biological provision required the transformation. The transformation was the prohibition's navigational cost, the price the biological provision extracted from the persons the provision was conducted through. The cost was consequential. The transformation consumed the persons, consumed the bodies, the consciousnesses, the identities the persons had maintained before the transformation's initiation. The consumption was the biological provision's price, the payment the prohibition's navigational requirement imposed on the persons whose biology the requirement was met through. The cost raised the question, was the prohibition's navigational requirement worth the cost? Was the biological provision's price the transformation's consumption of the persons the provision encompassed, justified by the prohibition's philosophical argument that the cognitive functions should be biological rather than artificial? The question was not answered in the saga's documented texts. The question was present, was implied by the transformation's documented character, was suggested by the contrast between the biological provision's personal costs and the artificial provision's potential absence of the same costs. The presence without the answer was the saga's approach to the question, the presentation of the question's dimensions without the definitive resolution the simpler narrative would have provided. The Ixian navigation machines were the question's most direct technological engagement, the engineering development that offered the navigational functions provision through mechanical means rather than through biological means. The machine's availability would have eliminated the transformation's necessity, would have provided the navigational function without the biological cost the transformation imposed on the persons the function's biological provision encompassed. The elimination would have been the prohibition's navigational relaxation. The navigational function, the function the prohibition reserved for the biological provision, would have been provided through the mechanical means the prohibition's strictest interpretation would have classified as the prohibited provision's approach. The relaxation would have been the acknowledgement that the prohibition's navigational cost, the transformation's consumption of the persons, was the cost the mechanical provision's availability made unnecessary. The unnecessariness was the transformation's ethical challenge. The transformation's necessity, the requirement that the navigational function be provided through the biological means the transformation constituted, was the necessity the mechanical provision's availability would have eliminated. The elimination would have meant the transformation was no longer necessary, that the persons consumed by the transformation were consumed by the cost the alternative's availability had made avoidable. The avoidability was the ethical challenge's content. The transformation that was necessary was the transformation the prohibition justified. The transformation that was avoidable was the transformation the prohibition could not justify without the additional argument the avoidability's challenge required. The challenge said, the transformation is avoidable. The prohibition must justify the transformation's continuation despite the transformation's avoidability. The justification was the prohibition's philosophical argument. The argument said, the biological provision is preferable because the biological provision maintains the consciousness the artificial provision would make unnecessary. The argument's application to the navigational dimension said, the navigational consciousness, the prescient perception the transformation produced, is the consciousness the mechanical navigation would replace. The replacement would make the consciousness unnecessary. The unnecessariness would be the prohibition's violation. The argument's application was complicated by the transformation's personal costs. The consciousness the prohibition preserved, the navigational consciousness the transformation produced, was the consciousness the transformation's personal costs were incurred to generate. The preservation of the consciousness and the imposition of the costs were both the prohibition's products, were both generated by the prohibition's requirement that the navigational function be biological rather than artificial. The complication was the question's deepest dimension, the dimension that balanced the consciousness's preservation against the person's consumption. The prohibition's philosophical value against the transformation's personal costs, the civilization's cognitive commitment against the navigator's experiential sacrifice. The navigators as the civilization's sacrifice was the dimension that connected the transformation's personal costs to the civilization's institutional benefits. The dimension that made the navigators the persons whose sacrifice the civilization's connectivity was purchased through. The sacrifice was real. The persons who were transformed into the navigators, whose bodies and whose consciousnesses the transformation consumed, were the persons whose sacrifice the civilization's navigational service was maintained through. The sacrifice was personal, was the loss of the individual's human form and human consciousness for the institutional function the civilization required. The sacrifice was also institutional. The Guild as an institution sacrificed its members, deployed the persons the institution selected for the transformation the institution's purpose demanded. The institutional sacrifice was the institutional decision, the determination that the institutional purpose's requirements justified the personal costs the requirements imposed. The justification was consequentialist. The institutional argument said the navigational service is necessary. The service requires the navigators. The navigators require the transformation. The transformation requires the sacrifice. The sacrifice is justified because the service the sacrifice provides is necessary for the civilization the service sustains. The consequentialist argument was effective. The argument's logic, the necessity chain that ran from the service through the navigators, through the transformation, through the sacrifice, was the logic the institutional assessment accepted as the justification the sacrifice required. The assessment concluded, the sacrifice is justified because the consequence the sacrifice produces is the service the civilization cannot function without. The argument's effectiveness did not eliminate the argument's costs. The sacrifice was justified. The sacrifice was also devastating. The justification and the devastation coexisted, were both present in the same decision, were both dimensions of the same institutional practice, were both qualities of the same transformation. The justification did not reduce the devastation. The devastation did not invalidate the justification. The coexistence was the sacrifice's character. The transformation's comparison with the God Emperor's transformation was the comparison the saga's narrative sustained through the two transformations' parallel documentation. The comparison between the Navigator's conversion and Leto II's conversion that the parallels sustained presence generated. The Navigators were transformed by the spice. Leto was transformed by the sand trout. The mechanisms were different. The spice's biochemistry versus the sand trout's biological integration. The products were different. The navigational consciousness versus the hybrid organism. The purposes were different. The navigational function versus the golden path's governance. The experiences were comparable. The loss of the human form, the progressive modification of the body from the recognizable human to the unrecognizable other, was the experience both transformations shared. The loss of the ordinary consciousness, the progressive alteration of the awareness from the human mode to the transformed mode, was the experience both transformations shared. The isolation, the separation from the human social environment the ordinary consciousness's psychological health required, was the experience both transformations encompassed. The comparability was the argument's shared dimension. Both transformations said, the human form can be sacrificed for the function the form's sacrifice produces. Both transformations said, the sacrifice is the price the function exacts from the persons the function's biological provision encompasses. Both transformations said, the price is consequential, is the loss of the personhood the price's payment involves. The differences were the argument's distinguishing dimensions. The Navigator's transformation was institutional, was conducted by the Guild's organizational operations for the navigational purpose the Guild's institutional existence served. Leto's transformation was personal, was undertaken by the individual consciousness for the civilizational purpose the individual's prescient assessment identified. The institutional versus the personal was the transformation's most consequential distinction. The Navigators were transformed by the institution. Leto transformed himself. The institutional transformation was imposed. The personal transformation was chosen. The imposition and the choice were different ethical qualities. The imposition was the institution's decision applied to the person. The choice was the person's decision applied to the person. The choice's presence in Leto's transformation and the imposition's presence in the Navigator's transformation were the ethical distinction the comparison encompassed. Leto chose the sacrifice. The Navigators accepted the sacrifice. The choosing and the accepting were different relationships with the transformation. The choosing was the autonomous decision. The accepting was the institutional response. The distinction complicated the ethical assessment. The transformation that was chosen, that was the autonomous decision of the consciousness the transformation was applied to, was the transformation whose ethical character the autonomy's presence modified. The transformation that was imposed. That was the institutional decision applied to the person the institution selected, was the transformation whose ethical character the imposition's presence modified. The modification was the distinction's ethical product. The chosen transformation was the transformation the choosing consciousness bore the responsibility for. The imposed transformation was the transformation the imposing institution bore the responsibility for. The responsibility's distribution was the distinction's ethical consequence, the determination of who bore the transformation's costs moral weight. Herbert's argument about the transformation was the argument the navigator's construction embedded in the saga's narrative, the argument about the relationship between the institutional purpose and the personal cost that the navigator's condition demonstrated. The argument said, the institutional purpose can consume the person. The institution that requires the person's sacrifice for the institution's function, that demands the body's modification and the consciousness's alteration for the capability the institution provides, is the institution that consumes the person for the purpose the institution serves. The consumption was the argument's subject. The argument examined the consumption, documented the transformation's personal costs, described the sacrifice's experiential dimensions, rendered the consumption's character with the detail the character's significance required. The examination was not the condemnation. The argument did not condemn the consumption, did not declare the institutional purpose's personal costs unacceptable, did not assert the transformation's sacrifice was unjustified. The argument examined, presented the costs alongside the benefits, documented the sacrifice alongside the service, rendered the consumption alongside the function. The examination was the argument's method. The method said, look at what the institutional purpose costs the persons the purpose encompasses. Look at the bodies the transformation modifies. Look at the consciousnesses the alteration produces. Look at the persons the sacrifice consumes. The looking was the argument. The looking was the method. The argument and the method were the same activity, the sustained attention to the transformation's dimensions that the attention's comprehensiveness provided. The sustained attention was the argument's moral quality. The attention that was sustained, that was maintained across the narrative's duration, that was applied to the transformation's dimensions with the comprehensiveness the dimension's significance required, was the attention the moral assessment demanded. The assessment required the attention. The attention required the sustaining. The sustaining was the narrative's contribution. The argument extended beyond the navigators to the civilization. The argument said, look at what the civilization costs the persons the civilization encompasses. Look at the sacrifices the civilization's institutional operations demand. Look at the persons the civilization's functions consume. The civilization is built on the persons. The persons are consumed by the building. The consumption is the civilization's cost. The cost was the argument's final dimension. The civilization that maintained the navigational service through the navigator's transformation was the civilization whose connectivity was purchased through the person's sacrifice. The connectivity was the product. The sacrifice was the price. The product and the price were both the civilization's dimensions, were both present in the same institutional operation, were both qualities of the same navigational function. The argument did not resolve the price's justification. The argument presented the price and the product and left the justification's assessment to the reader's consciousness. The consciousness that performed the assessment, that evaluated the product's value against the price's cost, was the consciousness the prohibition was designed to protect. The reader's consciousness performed the assessment, the navigator's consciousness could not. The transformation rendered the navigators incapable of the assessment. The consciousness that was altered by the transformation, that was converted from the ordinary mode to the navigational mode, was the consciousness that could not assess the transformation's justification from the perspective the assessment required. The assessment required the ordinary consciousness. The navigators did not possess the ordinary consciousness. The navigators could not assess. The inability was the transformation's final horror. The persons who most needed to assess the transformation's justification were the persons whose transformation had eliminated the capability the assessment required. The transformation consumed the assessment's capability alongside the body and the consciousness the transformation consumed. The persons who lived the transformation could not evaluate the transformation. The evaluation was the untransformed consciousness's function, the function the transformation's subjects could not perform. The reader performed the evaluation. The reader, the consciousness that encountered the transformation's documentation through the narrative's rendering, was the consciousness whose ordinary mode the evaluation's performance required. The reader's consciousness was untransformed. The reader's consciousness could assess. The reader's consciousness was invited to assess by the narrative's sustained attention to the transformation's dimensions. The invitation was the argument's purpose. The argument's purpose was not the resolution, was not the determination of whether the transformation was justified. The argument's purpose was the assessment, the invitation to the untransformed consciousness to perform the evaluation the transformed consciousness could not. The horrifying transformation of Dune's Guild Navigators. The transformation that consumed the person for the function. The transformation that sacrificed the body for the navigation. The transformation that altered the consciousness for the perception. The transformation that isolated the navigator for the service. The transformation was the civilization's navigational cost. The cost was paid by the persons the transformation encompassed. The persons could not assess whether the cost was justified. The assessment was the reader's. The civilization maintained the navigation. The navigation required the transformation. The transformation consumed the persons. The persons became the navigators. The navigators guided the ships. The ships connected the worlds. The worlds constituted the civilization. The civilization was built on the transformation. The transformation was built on the persons. The persons were consumed. The consumption was the horror. The horror was the transformation. The transformation's temporal progression, the stages through which the conversion from the human to the navigator was conducted across the duration the transformation encompassed, was the progression whose examination reveals the transformation's character in its developmental dimension. The early stage was the adjustment. The candidate who was initiated, who was placed in the tank's atmospheric conditions for the transformation's activation, experienced the early period as the adjustment to the conditions the tank imposed. The adjustment was biological, was the organism's response to the atmospheric conditions the tank maintained, was the physiology's adaptation to the spice concentrations the navigational function required. The adjustment was difficult. The organism whose biology had been prepared through the gradual exposure the preparation provided was nevertheless confronted with the concentrations the preparation could only approximate. The full concentrations exceeded the preparation's levels. The exceedance was the adjustment's challenge, the biological demand, the full conditions imposed on the organism the preparation had partially readied. The adjustment included the respiratory adaptation. The lungs, the organs whose function the atmospheric processing constituted, adapted to the spice-saturated atmosphere the tank maintained. The adaptation was the respiratory system's response to the conditions the system had not evolved for. The biological accommodation of the atmospheric composition the human respiratory evolution's natural environment had not included. The accommodation was uncomfortable. The lungs that were processing the spice-saturated atmosphere were the lungs whose ordinary function the natural atmosphere's composition had calibrated. The calibration's deviation, the distance between the ordinary atmosphere and the spice-saturated atmosphere, was the discomfort's source. The lungs worked. The lungs did not work comfortably. The functioning and the discomfort coexisted. The adjustment period lasted weeks. The biological adaptation the full concentrations required, the physiological accommodation the sustained exposure demanded, was the adaptation whose timeline the biology's response mechanisms determined. The weeks were the biology's duration, the period the physiology required for the accommodation the conditions sustained presence imposed. The middle stage was the modification. The candidate whose adjustment the early period had accomplished was the candidate whose biology the middle period's sustained exposure was modifying. The modification was the transformation's substantive phase, the period during which the biological changes the transformation constituted were produced through the sustained saturation's biochemical operations. The modification operated on multiple systems simultaneously. The neural system was modified, was expanded through the growth the prescient perception's development required. The integumentary system was modified, was altered through the sustained immersion's biochemical effects on the skin's cellular architecture. The musculoskeletal system was modified, was reduced through the disuse the tank's conditions imposed on the structures the locomotion and the manipulation utilized. The simultaneity was the modification's most demanding quality. The biology that was being modified on multiple systems simultaneously, that was experiencing the changes the sustained saturation produced in every dimension the saturation's biochemistry contacted, was the biology that was sustaining the modification's comprehensive demands across the systems the modification encompassed. The demands were cumulative. Each system's modification added to the organism's biological load, added the metabolic demands the modification's biochemical processes required, added the physiological stress the modification's structural changes imposed. The cumulation was the middle stage's most consequential quality, the quality that made the modifications period the transformation's most biologically demanding phase. The late stage was the stabilization, the candidate whose biology the middle period had modified, whose systems had been altered by the sustained saturation's biochemical operations, entered the period during which the modifications reached the conditions the navigational function's requirements specified. The stabilization was not the completion, was not the modification's cessation through the achievement of the final form the modification was progressing toward. The stabilization was the modification's deceleration, the reduction of the modification's rate from the middle stage's intensive progression to the late stage's sustained but slower continuation. The deceleration was the navigational function's activation. The prescient perception, the consciousness's awareness of the probability space's navigational dimension, emerged during the late stage's stabilization. The perception's emergence was the transformation's functional product, The capability, the transformations, biological modifications had been conducted to produce. The emergence was gradual. The prescient perception did not appear suddenly, did not activate in the single moment the emergence's dramatic presentation might have suggested. The perception emerged progressively, developed across the stabilization period's duration, intensified as the neural architecture's growth reached the dimensions the perception's operation required, deepened as the consciousness's alteration progressed toward the navigational mode the perception constituted. The gradual emergence was the consciousness's experience of the capability's development. The person inside the consciousness, the person whose awareness the transformation was altering, experienced the perception's emergence as the progressive addition of the awareness the perception encompassed. The addition was the experience, the sustained encounter with the probability space's navigational content as the content was progressively revealed by the perception's developing capability. The experience was both the wonder and the loss simultaneously. The wonder was the perception's content, the awareness of the probability space's structure the perception's development was revealing. The loss was the ordinary consciousness's diminishment, the reduction of the ordinary awareness's engagement that the perception's expansion was producing. The wonder and the loss were simultaneous. The person experienced both. The simultaneity was the experience's defining quality, the navigator's daily existence, the ongoing, sustained, indefinite condition the transformation's completion produced, was the existence whose examination reveals the transformation's personal dimension in its sustained expression. The existence was conducted in the tank. The navigator's daily life, the ongoing experience the sustained condition constituted, was the experience of the tank's conditions. The tank was the environment. The environment was the tank. The identity between the environment and the tank was the existence's most constraining quality, the quality that made the navigator's world the tank's world, the existence's scope the tank's scope, the experience's dimensions the tank's dimensions. The tank's dimensions were limited. The chamber's physical extent, the spatial volume the engineering's design provided, was the volume the navigator's existence was conducted within. The volume was sufficient for the organism's containment. The volume was not sufficient for the person's exploration. The containment and the exploration were different requirements. The containment was the organism's spatial accommodation. The exploration was the person's spatial engagement. The non-exploration was the existence's spatial limitation. The navigator could not explore, could not move through the spaces the ordinary person's daily existence encompassed, could not traverse the distances the ordinary person's activities included, could not engage with the physical environment the ordinary person's perception navigated. The limitation was partially compensated by the prescient perception. The consciousness, whose ordinary spatial engagement was limited by the tank's dimensions, was the consciousness whose prescient engagement encompassed the probability space's navigational dimensions. The prescient dimensions exceeded the tank's dimensions, extended beyond the physical space the tank encompassed into the probabilistic space the prescient perception revealed. The compensation was partial. The prescient dimensions were not the physical dimensions. The probability space was not the physical space. The prescient perception's engagement with the probability space's content was not the physical engagement with the physical environment's content. The compensation addressed the consciousness's perceptual scope. The compensation did not address the person's physical experience. The distinction between the perceptual scope and the physical experience was the existence's compensated but not satisfied quality. The consciousness had the scope, had the prescient perceptions, comprehensive awareness of the probability space's navigational content. The person did not have the experience, did not have the physical engagement with the physical environment the person's existence, the pre-transformation condition, had encompassed. The daily routine, to the extent the navigator's existence included the routine the term described, was the routine the navigational functions, operations imposed, the navigational assignments, the ships the navigator guided through the fold-space passages the Guild's commercial service provided, were the assignments the routine's operational dimension encompassed. The assignments were the existence's functional content. The navigator's engagement with the navigational function, the prescient perceptions deployment for the ship's safe guidance through the fold-space passages, was the engagement the assignment's operational requirements constituted. The engagement was the existence's purpose, was the function the transformation had been conducted to produce, was the activity the navigator's condition was maintained to sustain. The engagement between the assignments was the existence's non-functional content. The navigator's awareness between the navigational deployments, the consciousness's operation in the intervals the assignment's scheduling did not encompass, was the awareness the non-functional period's temporal extent contained. The non-functional period's content was the consciousness's solitary engagement with the probability space's non-navigational content. The prescient perception, the awareness that was oriented toward the probable, perceived the probability space's broader dimensions alongside the navigational dimensions the function's requirements specified. The broader dimensions included the futures the non-navigational probability space contained, the probable developments the broader assessment encompassed alongside the navigational paths the functional assessment identified. The broader perception was the existence's contemplative dimension. The navigator, whose functional engagement addressed the navigational assignment's operational requirements, experienced the non-functional periods as the contemplative engagement with the broader probability space, as the sustained awareness of the probable futures the broader perception encompassed. The contemplation was the existence's intellectual dimension. The navigator's awareness, operating in the prescient mode the transformation had produced, contemplated the probability space's content with the comprehensiveness the altered consciousness's perceptual orientation provided. The contemplation was sustained, was maintained across the non-functional period's duration, was conducted through the altered consciousness's ongoing operation. The spice gas environment's sensory character was the character the navigator experienced through the senses the transformation had modified. The ongoing, sustained, comprehensive sensory experience the tank's atmospheric conditions produced. The gas was orange. The atmospheric concentration the tank maintained, the spice gas whose concentration the navigational function required, was the atmosphere whose visual character the orange colouring constituted. The orange was the environment's visual quality, was the dominant colour the navigator's visual perception encountered in the tank's atmospheric conditions. The orange was pervasive. The colouring was present in every direction the visual perception encompassed, was the atmospheric quality the gas's concentration produced in the air the tank contained. The pervasiveness was the environment's visual monotony, the sustained, comprehensive, unchanging visual quality the atmospheric conditions imposed on the navigator's visual experience. The monotony was the sensory environment's most consequential quality. The navigator, whose visual experience was the sustained orange, whose visual perception encountered the pervasive colouring the gas's concentration produced, was the navigator whose visual engagement with the environment was the engagement the monotony constituted. The engagement was limited, was bounded by the monotony's unchanging character, was constrained by the coloring's pervasive presence. The gas had a scent. The atmospheric concentration that produced the visual coloring also produced the olfactory quality the spice's aromatic compounds generated. The scent was present in every breath, was the olfactory input, the respiratory processing introduced into the sensory awareness the breathing sustained. The scent was sustained. The navigator, whose breathing processed the spice, saturated atmosphere, breathed the scent with every breath, experienced the olfactory quality as the sustained, ongoing, uninterrupted sensory input the atmospheric conditions imposed. The sustaining was the scent's most consequential quality, the quality that made the olfactory experience the ongoing encounter with the same sensory input the breathing's sustained operation provided. The sustained monotony, the visual and the olfactory, was the sensory environment's combined character. The navigator whose sensory experience was the sustained orange and the sustained scent was the navigator whose sensory engagement with the environment was the engagement the combined monotony constituted. The engagement was limited by the monotony's character. The limitation was the sensory deprivation the monotony produced. The reduction of the sensory input's variety to the levels the monotonous environment provided. The sensory deprivation's effects on the consciousness were the effects the psychology's understanding of the deprivation's consequences encompassed. The consciousness that was subjected to the sustained sensory monotony, that experienced the reduced variety the deprivation's conditions imposed, was the consciousness whose psychological condition the deprivation's sustained presence affected. The effects were partially compensated by the prescient perception. The consciousness whose sensory engagement with the physical environment was monotonous was the consciousness whose prescient engagement with the probability space was rich, was the consciousness whose perceptual experience included the probability space's complex content alongside the tank's monotonous conditions. The prescient perception's richness compensated for the sensory environment's poverty. The compensation addressed the consciousness's perceptual needs. The compensation did not address the person's sensory needs. The Guild's institutional management of navigators was the management the organizational apparatus conducted for the navigational function's sustained operation. The institutional activities the navigator's conditions maintenance and the navigational services provision required. The management included the supply. The spice that the tank's atmospheric conditions required, the melange whose concentration the navigational function demanded, was supplied through the Guild's commercial operations. The supply was the management's most consequential logistical function, the provision whose reliability the navigational service's continuation depended on. The supply's reliability was the management's primary concern. The navigator's biological dependency on the spice, the addiction whose physiological character the sustained consumption established, meant the supply's interruption would produce the biological crisis the dependency's absence generated. The crisis would be lethal. The interruption would kill the navigators. The lethality made the supply's reliability the management's most consequential requirement. The management included the tank's maintenance. The sealed chambers whose atmospheric conditions the navigational function required, whose engineering specifications the atmospheric concentration and the environmental conditions the transformation's maintenance demanded, were maintained through the Guild's technical operations. The maintenance was the management's engineering function. The sustained attention to the tank's physical conditions the navigational function's atmospheric requirements necessitated. The maintenance was comprehensive. The tank's atmospheric systems, the equipment that maintained the spice gas concentration, the temperature, The pressure the navigational functions conditions specified were maintained with the precision the atmospheric requirements sensitivity demanded. The precision was the maintenance's most consequential quality, the quality that ensured the atmospheric conditions sustained operation within the parameters the navigational function required. The management included the navigator's health, the biological organisms whose condition the transformations sustained, whose physiology the modifications' effects maintained in the transformed state, were the organisms whose health the management's medical function addressed. The medical attention was the management's biological function. The sustained monitoring of the transformed biology's condition the navigational function's continuation required. The medical attention was specialized. The navigator's biology, modified by the transformation's sustained operation, was the biology the ordinary medical knowledge did not encompass. The medical attention required the specialized understanding the transformed biology's character demanded, the knowledge of the modification's effects, the awareness of the transformed physiology's requirements, the comprehension of the biological condition the ordinary medical training had not addressed. The specialized knowledge was the Guild's institutional asset. The knowledge of the navigator's biological condition, the understanding of the transformation's effects, the awareness of the modified physiology's requirements, was maintained within the Guild's institutional knowledge base with the confidentiality the Guild's operational secrecy applied. The management included the assignment. The navigational deployments, the ships the navigators guided through the fold space passages the Guild's commercial service provided, were assigned through the Guild's operational planning. The planning was the management's operational function, the scheduling of the navigational services provision across the ships and the routes the Guild's commercial operations encompassed. The assignment considered the navigator's capabilities. The individual navigators' prescient perceptions, the varying capabilities the individual transformations had produced in the individual consciousnesses the transformation encompassed, were assessed for the assignments the capabilities levels were suited to. The more capable navigators received the more demanding assignments. The less capable navigators received the less demanding assignments. The calibration was the assignment's quality management, the matching of the capability to the demand the assignment's navigational requirements constituted. The navigator's relationship with the ship was the relationship the navigational function constituted. The connection between the consciousness that guided and the vessel that was guided through the fold space passage the consciousness's perception identified. The relationship was functional. The navigator guided the ship. The ship was guided by the navigator. The function connected them, connected the consciousness and the vessel through the navigational activity the function constituted. The relationship was also intimate. The navigator's prescient perception, the consciousness's awareness of the fold space paths the ship's safe passage required, was the perception that encompassed the ship's trajectory. The encompassing was the intimacy, the consciousness's sustained engagement with the vessel's movement through the probability space the consciousness perceived. The intimacy was one-directional. The navigator engaged with the ship. The ship did not engage with the navigator. The ship was the vessel, was the physical object the navigational function guided through the passage the function identified. The ship did not perceive the navigator. The ship did not respond to the navigator. The ship was guided. The guiding was the navigator's activity. The being guided was the ship's condition. The one-directionality was the relationship's isolation's expression. The navigator, whose consciousness engaged with the ship, whose prescient perception encompassed the vessel's trajectory, whose awareness sustained the ship's safe passage, was the navigator whose engagement was not reciprocated by the vessel the engagement was directed toward. The non-reciprocation was the isolation, the relationship's one-directional character expressed as the consciousness's unreciprocated engagement. The unreciprocated engagement was the navigator's experience of the navigational function. The function was the consciousness's directed activity. The activity was not responded to. The response's absence was the function's experiential quality, the quality that made the navigational activity the solitary operation the consciousness conducted without the engagement's reciprocation. The navigator guided thousands of passages. Across the years and the decades, the navigational service's sustained operation encompassed. Across the assignments the Guild's operational planning deployed the navigator for, the navigator guided the ships through the fold-space passages the prescient perception identified. Each passage was the function's exercise. Each exercise was the solitary engagement. Each engagement was the unreciprocated activity. The accumulation of the unreciprocated engagements was the function's experiential weight. The navigator, whose sustained operation had guided thousands of passages, was the navigator whose experience included the thousands of the solitary activities the engagements constituted. The weight was cumulative. The weight was sustained. The weight was the function's personal cost across the operational duration the function's sustained exercise encompassed. The weight was not the transformation's most dramatic cost. The weight was the transformation's most sustained cost, the cost whose duration exceeded the transformation's initial cost's duration, the cost whose accumulation exceeded the transformation's initial cost's magnitude through the accumulation's sustained progression. The sustained cost was the existence's character. The navigator, whose daily existence was the existence the transformation produced, whose ongoing condition was the condition the sustained saturation maintained, was the navigator whose existence's character included the weight the sustained cost's accumulation constituted. The character was the horror, not the dramatic horror the transformation's initial stages produced, not the body's modification's visual impact, not the consciousness's alteration's psychological distress. The sustained horror, the ongoing, accumulated, indefinitely maintained condition the transformation's sustained operation constituted. The sustained horror was the transformation's deepest dimension. The transformation was not the event. The transformation was the condition, the sustained, ongoing, indefinitely maintained state the transformation's initiation had produced, and the transformation's continuation sustained. The condition was the horror. The horror was the condition. The horrifying transformation of Dune's Guild Navigators. The transformation's irreversibility was the quality that made every other dimension of the transformation consequential, the quality whose presence converted every modification from the temporary condition the reversal could address to the permanent condition the reversal could not. The irreversibility operated through the biochemistry. The modifications, the sustained spice saturation produced in the organism's biology, were modifications the biology's homeostatic mechanisms could not reverse. The mechanisms maintained the organism's biological equilibrium. The systems that restored the organism's condition to the baseline the systems were calibrated to maintain were themselves modified by the saturation's sustained operation. The system's modification meant the systems could not restore the pre-modification baseline, could not return the organism to the condition the system's pre-modification calibration had maintained. The system's modification was the irreversibility's mechanism. The restoration's instruments were themselves altered. The instruments that should have restored the baseline were calibrated to the new condition the modification had produced. The instruments maintained the modification rather than reversing it. The maintenance was the irreversibility, was the biological condition in which the restoration's mechanisms sustained the modification rather than undoing it. The irreversibility was comprehensive. Every system the modification had altered, the neural, the integumentary, the musculoskeletal, the respiratory, was altered in the ways the reversal's mechanisms could not address. The comprehensiveness meant the restoration was impossible on every dimension, meant no partial reversal could be achieved, meant no selective undoing of the modification's individual components could be performed. The comprehensiveness was the irreversibility's most devastating quality for the person inside the navigator's consciousness. The person who might have wanted the reversal, who might have desired the return to the pre-modification condition the ordinary human experience constituted, was the person for whom the reversal was comprehensively unavailable. The wanting could not produce the having. The desire could not generate the restoration. The gap between the wanting and the having was the irreversibility's personal experience, the sustained awareness that the condition the person inhabited was the condition the person could not leave. The awareness was the prison's psychological dimension. The navigator who knew the transformation was irreversible, who understood that the condition the transformation had produced was the condition the navigator would inhabit for the remainder of the existence the condition encompassed, was the navigator whose awareness of the permanence was the prison's most constraining wall. The wall was not physical, the wall was informational, was the knowledge that the condition was permanent, the awareness that the modification could not be undone, the understanding that the person's future was the condition's continuation. The knowledge was sustained. The navigator lived with the knowledge, inhabited the awareness of the permanence alongside the awareness of the probability space the prescient perception provided. The two awarenesses coexisted. The awareness of the navigational dimension's content and the awareness of the condition's permanence, and the coexistence was the consciousness's sustained experience. What the navigator lost from the human experience was the inventory the transformation's personal costs encompassed, the catalogue of the ordinary human experience's dimensions the transformation's effects had eliminated or reduced from the navigator's condition. The navigator lost the walking. The ordinary human experience included the locomotion, the movement through the physical space the musculoskeletal system's operation provided. The walking was the engagement with the physical environment through the body's traversal of the environment's space. The navigator did not walk. The navigator inhabited the tank. The tank's dimensions did not permit the walking the ordinary human locomotion encompassed. The loss of the walking was the loss of the physical engagement the walking constituted. The walking was not simply the movement from one location to another. The walking was the body's experience of the movement, the sensory engagement with the ground, the air, the environment the movement traversed. The walking was the physical experience the tank's conditions did not provide. The navigator lost the touching. The ordinary human experience included the tactile engagement with the physical world. The sensory experienced the skin's contact with the objects, the persons, the environmental features the tactile engagement encompassed. The navigator did not touch. The navigator was immersed in the spice gas. The immersion's sensory character was the gas's character, was the sustained contact with the atmospheric medium the tank maintained rather than the varied contact with the diverse objects the ordinary tactile experience encompassed. The loss of the touching was the loss of the sensory variety the touching constituted. The ordinary tactile experience included the contact with different textures, different temperatures, different surfaces, the variety the diverse objects the ordinary environment contained provided. The navigator's tactile experience was the sustained contact with the gas, was the uniform sensory input the atmospheric immersion generated. The variety was lost. The uniformity replaced it. The navigator lost the eating. The ordinary human experience included the nutritional consumption, the eating, the dietary practices, the cultural traditions maintained, and the biological requirements the metabolism demanded. The navigator's nutrition was conducted through the atmospheric absorption, through the gases provision of the metabolic inputs the organism's sustaining required. The atmospheric provision was not the eating, was not the sensory experience the food's consumption encompassed, was not the social activity the eating's communal character constituted, was not the pleasure the food's taste and the eating's satisfaction provided. The loss of the eating was the loss of the pleasurable and the social dimensions the eating constituted. The eating was not simply the nutrition. The eating was the sensory pleasure the food provided. The eating was the social activity the communal consumption sustained. The eating was the cultural practice the dietary traditions maintained. The atmospheric nutrition was the nutrition without the pleasure, without the sociality, without the culture. The nutrition was preserved. The dimensions were lost. The navigator lost the human contact. The ordinary human experience included the interpersonal engagement, the social interactions, the face-to-face encounters, the physical proximity, the communicative exchanges the human social life constituted. The navigator's social experience was the functional communication the institutional operations provided. The exchanges the navigational functions management required, rather than the exchanges the personal connection the social life sustained. The loss of the human contact was the loss of the social dimension the human consciousness's psychological health depended on. The consciousness that was separated from the human social environment, that was isolated from the interpersonal engagement the social life constituted, was the consciousness whose psychological condition reflected the isolation's effects. The effects or the deprivation's products were generated by the sustained absence of the social engagement the consciousness's design required. The navigator lost the sky. The ordinary human experience included the atmospheric engagement, the visual encounter with the sky, the weather, the celestial features the planetary surface's upward view encompassed. The navigator's visual experience was the tank's interior, was the sealed chamber's enclosed space, the orange-saturated atmosphere's sustained visual field. The sky was absent. The sky's visual variety, the clouds, the sun, the stars, the colours the atmospheric conditions produced, was absent from the navigator's visual experience. The loss of the sky was the loss of the visual infinity the sky constituted. The sky was the visual dimension the enclosed environment could not provide, the upward extent the ceiling did not encompass, the distance the walls did not reach, the openness the enclosure did not produce. The sky's absence was the enclosure's most consequential visual consequence, the replacement of the infinite visual dimension with the finite visual space the tank's interior encompassed. The losses accumulated. Each loss, the walking, the touching, the eating, the human contact, the sky, was the individual reduction the transformation imposed on the human experience the navigator had previously inhabited. The losses aggregate was the transformation's personal cost, the total reduction the individual losses combination constituted. The aggregate was devastating. The human experience's dimensions, the walking, the touching, the eating, the contact, the sky, were the dimensions the experience's quality depended on. The dimension's aggregate reduction was the quality's aggregate reduction. The experience's quality was diminished by the aggregate the losses combination produced. The navigator's perception of time was the perception the transformation's cognitive effects produced in the temporal dimension. The awareness of the time's passage, the altered consciousness's temporal orientation generated. The ordinary consciousness perceived time sequentially. The present was the experienced moment. The past was the memory. The future was the anticipation. The sequential perception was the ordinary consciousness's temporal mode. The way the awareness engaged with the temporal dimension through the succession of the experienced moments the temporal progression provided. The navigational consciousness perceived time probabilistically. The present was the experienced moment alongside the probable futures the prescient perception encompassed. The past was the memory alongside the probable pasts the prescient perception's retrospective dimension accessed. The future was the perception, was the awareness of the probable developments the prescient consciousness's forward dimension revealed. The probabilistic perception altered the time's experiential character. The time that the ordinary consciousness experienced as the sequential progression, as the movement from the past through the present toward the future, the sequential perception tracked, was the time the navigational consciousness experienced as the simultaneous presence, as the coexistence of the past and the present and the probable future in the awareness, the prescient perceptions. Comprehensive operation maintained. The simultaneous presence changed the time's felt quality. The time that felt like the progression, like the movement through the moments the sequential perception tracked, was the time that felt like the presence, like the sustained awareness of the temporal dimension's comprehensive content the prescient perception encompassed. The change was disorienting. The consciousness whose temporal perception had been sequential, whose engagement with the time had been the progressive movement through the moments the sequential mode provided, was the consciousness whose temporal perception was converted to the simultaneous by the transformation's cognitive effects. The conversion was the temporal dimension's transformation, the alteration of the time's experiential character from the sequential to the simultaneous that the prescient consciousness's development produced. The disorientation was sustained. The navigator, whose temporal perception was the simultaneous, whose awareness of the time was the comprehensive presence the prescient perception maintained, was the navigator whose temporal experience was the sustained disorientation the simultaneous mode produced in the consciousness the sequential mode had formed. The disorientation was not the confusion, was not the inability to perceive the time's dimension. The disorientation was the unfamiliarity, was the consciousness's sustained encounter with the temporal mode the consciousness's pre-transformation formation had not prepared the consciousness for. The unfamiliarity persisted. The consciousness that inhabited the simultaneous mode did not become familiar with the mode, did not develop the comfort the sustained inhabitation might have been expected to produce. The unfamiliarity was sustained because the consciousness retained the memory of the sequential mode, retained the experiential reference the pre-transformation temporal perception constituted. The memory was the comparison's source. The comparison sustained the unfamiliarity. The unfamiliarity was the comparison's product. The civilization's moral debt to the navigators was the debt the saga's ecological argument identified, the obligation the civilization bore for the persons the civilization's navigational function consumed. The debt was the consumption's moral consequence. The civilization that consumed the persons, that used the navigational function the transformation produced at the cost of the person's human experience, was the civilization that incurred the moral obligation the consumption generated. The obligation was the debt, was the moral account the consumption's personal costs entered into the civilization's moral ledger. The debt was not acknowledged. The civilization that consumed the persons did not acknowledge the consumption's moral character, did not recognize the transformation's personal costs as the moral obligation the civilization bore. The non-acknowledgement was the civilization's moral gap, the absence of the recognition the consumption's moral character required from the civilization the consumption served. The non-acknowledgement was produced by the distance. The civilization's consumers of the navigational service, the persons and the institutions whose interstellar connectivity the navigation maintained, were distant from the navigators whose transformation the service depended on. The distance was physical. The navigators were sealed in the tanks the Guild's facilities maintained. The distance was institutional. The navigators were managed by the Guild's organizational apparatus rather than by the civilization's direct engagement. The distance was psychological. The navigators' concealment maintained the uncertainty the civilization's consumers inhabited regarding the navigators' condition. The distance's combination produced the non-acknowledgement. The civilization did not acknowledge the debt because the civilization did not perceive the debt. The civilization did not perceive the debt because the distances prevented the perception. The distance's prevention was the moral gap's mechanism, the process through which the obligation's existence was concealed from the consciousness the obligation was owed by. The mechanism was the saga's commentary on the relationship between the consumption and the moral awareness. The commentary said, the consumption's moral costs are concealed by the distances the consumption's institutional architecture maintains. The consumers do not perceive the costs because the distances prevent the perception. The prevention sustains the consumption by sustaining the consumer's non-awareness of the consumption's moral character. The commentary was not limited to the navigators. The commentary extended to every dimension of the civilization's institutional operations whose personal costs the institutional architecture's distances concealed from the consumer's awareness. The navigators were the commentary's most dramatic demonstration, the most vivid case of the personal costs the distances concealed. The demonstration was the commentary's argument's vehicle, the case through which the argument's content was communicated to the reader's awareness. The navigator's place in Herbert's ecological argument was the place the organism's institutional function occupied in the saga's sustained examination of the relationship between the civilization and the ecology the civilization depended on. The navigators were the dependency's most personal expression. The civilization's dependency on the spice, the structural reliance on the substance the sandworm ecology produced, was expressed most personally in the navigator's transformation. The navigators consumed the spice. The consumption transformed the navigators. The transformation maintained the navigation. The navigation sustained the civilization. The chain ran from the spice, through the navigators, through the navigation, through the civilization, each link connected to the preceding link through the dependency the chain's structure constituted. The navigators were the chain's human link. The link between the spice and the navigation, between the substance and the function, was the link the navigators constituted. The link was human, was composed of the persons whose transformation the substance's consumption produced, and whose transformation the function's operation required. The human composition was the link's most consequential quality, the quality that made the dependency's chain a chain that included the persons alongside the substances and the functions. The inclusion of the persons was the ecological argument's ethical dimension. The argument said the civilization's dependency encompasses the persons. The dependency does not simply connect the substance to the function. The dependency connects the substance to the persons to the function. The persons are the dependency's medium. The persons are consumed by the dependency. The consumption is the dependency's personal cost. The cost was the argument's ethical content. The argument's ecological dimension said the civilization depends on the ecology. The argument's ethical dimension said the dependency consumes the persons. The two dimensions combined to produce the argument's comprehensive content. The content that encompassed both the ecological dependency's structural character and the personal costs the dependency's institutional expression generated. The navigators were the argument's ethical demonstration. The persons whose transformation the dependency consumed, whose bodies and whose consciousnesses the dependency's institutional expression modified, were the persons through whom the argument's ethical content was demonstrated. The demonstration was the transformation's documentation, the sustained, detailed, narratively rendered examination of what the dependency cost the persons the dependency encompassed. The documentation was the argument's moral function. The argument that documented the costs, that rendered the transformation's personal dimensions with the detail the dimension's significance required, was the argument that performed the moral function the non-acknowledgement's institutional architecture prevented. The argument acknowledged the costs. The argument perceived the debt. The argument performed the recognition the civilization's distances prevented. The performance was the reader's experience. The reader who encountered the argument's documentation, who engaged with the transformation's rendered dimensions through the narrative's sustained attention, was the reader whose awareness included the costs the civilization's distances concealed. The reader's awareness was the argument's product, was the moral perception the documentation generated in the consciousness the documentation was presented to. The product was the argument's purpose. The purpose was not the resolution, was not the determination of whether the transformation was justified or the civilization's debt was payable. The purpose was the awareness, the moral perception of the costs the institutional architecture's distances concealed from the civilization's consumer's consciousness. The awareness was the argument's gift. The gift was not comfortable. The awareness of the costs was not the comfortable awareness the comfortable narrative would have provided. The awareness was disturbing. Was the perception of the cost's personal dimensions the comfortable narrative's avoidance of the cost's examination would have prevented? The disturbance was the argument's intention. The argument intended the disturbance, intended the discomfort the cost's awareness produced in the consciousness the awareness was generated in. The intention was the argument's moral character, the moral quality of the narrative that chose to document the costs rather than to conceal them, that chose to render the transformation rather than to abstract it, that chose to show the persons rather than to hide them. The showing was the narrative's moral act. The hiding was the institutional architecture's moral failure. The showing and the hiding were the two approaches the transformation's documentation could take. The narrative chose the showing. The civilization chose the hiding. The choices were opposite. The choices were the moral dimension's content. The horrifying transformation of Dune's Guild Navigators. The transformation that was shown. The costs that were documented, the persons that were rendered, the awareness that was produced. The narrative showed what the civilization hid. The showing was the gift. The gift was the awareness. The awareness was the horror. The horror was the truth. The truth was the transformation. The navigator's pre-transformation life was the life the transformation consumed, the existence the person had maintained before the institutional process's selection identified the person as the candidate the navigational function's requirements specified. The person had been a person. The statement's apparent obviousness concealed the statement's most consequential content, the content that the transformed organism inside the navigation tank had once been a human being whose existence included every dimension the ordinary human existence encompassed. The person had walked on worlds. The person had breathed the ordinary air. The person had eaten food. The person had touched other persons. The person had seen the sky. The pre-transformation existence was the existence the transformation replaced. The replacement was comprehensive, encompassed every dimension the pre-transformation existence had included, converted every element of the ordinary human experience into the corresponding element of the navigational existence the transformation produced. The walking was replaced by the floating. The ordinary air was replaced by the spice gas. The food was replaced by the atmospheric absorption. The touching was replaced by the immersion. The sky was replaced by the tank's ceiling. The replacement's comprehensiveness was the transformation's most personally consequential quality when assessed from the pre-transformation existence's perspective. The person who had inhabited the ordinary existence, who had experienced every dimension the ordinary human life encompassed, was the person whose experience was comprehensively converted into the dimensions the navigational existence constituted. Every dimension was replaced. Every element was converted. Every quality was transformed. The person might have had family. The pre-transformation existence's social dimension, the relationships the person had maintained with the persons the social life encompassed, was the dimension the transformation's isolation comprehensively severed. The family members the person had maintained the relationships with, the parents, the siblings, the partners, the children the social life might have included, were the persons the transformation's isolation separated the navigator from. The separation was permanent. The irreversibility that characterized every other dimension of the transformation characterized the social dimension alongside the biological and the psychological. The separated family members could not be returned to. The severed relationships could not be restored. The isolation was as permanent as the transformation, was maintained across the duration the navigational existence encompassed. The permanence was the transformation's most emotionally consequential quality for the persons the separation affected. The family members who lost the person to the transformation, whose relationship with the person the transformation's isolation severed, were the persons whose loss the permanence sustained across the duration the permanence encompassed. The loss was not the death. The person was not dead, was maintained in the tank's conditions, was sustained by the atmospheric provision the tank provided. The loss was the separation, the removal of the person from the social environment the relationship depended on for the relationship's sustained maintenance. The separation was worse than the death in the dimension the closure encompassed. The death provided the closure, provided the definitive termination the mourning's psychological process could address. The separation did not provide the closure, maintained the person's existence alongside the relationship's termination, sustained the person's biological continuation alongside the relationship's functional cessation. The sustained existence without the relationship was the separation's most consequential quality. The family knew the person was alive. The family knew the person was in the tank. The family knew the person was transformed. The knowledge sustained the relationship's emotional presence alongside the relationship's functional absence. The emotional presence without the functional presence was the separation's characteristic, the quality that made the separation, the loss without the closure. The transformation compared to the saga's other sacrifices was the comparison that placed the navigator's condition alongside the other personal costs the saga's institutional operations demanded from the persons the operations encompassed. The Sardakar's sacrifice was the sacrifice of the prisoners whose survival the prison planet's conditions filtered for the military force's recruitment. The sacrifice was the condition's harshness, the environmental demands the Salusa Secundus's conditions imposed on the prisoners whose survival the conditions tested. The sacrifice was involuntary, was imposed by the imprisonment the governance's penal system administered rather than by the candidacy the institutional process's selection identified. The comparison with the navigator's sacrifice illuminated the voluntary dimension. The navigator's sacrifice included the candidacy's acceptance, included the person's decision to enter the institutional process the transformation constituted. The Sardakar's sacrifice did not include the decision, was imposed by the conditions the imprisonment generated rather than by the choice the candidacy encompassed. The Bene Gesserit's sacrifice was the sacrifice of the practitioners whose training the institutional disciplines demanded. The sacrifice was the training's personal costs. The subordination of the individual to the institutional purpose the training specified, the management of the personal dimensions within the institutional framework the training maintained. The comparison with the navigator's sacrifice illuminated the degree dimension. The Bene Gesserit's sacrifice was the sacrifice of the personal autonomy within the institutional framework. The navigator's sacrifice was the sacrifice of the personal existence within the biological transformation. The autonomy's sacrifice was the lesser degree. The existence's sacrifice was the greater degree. The difference was the transformation's biological comprehensiveness. The quality that made the navigator's sacrifice the sacrifice that encompassed the person's biology alongside the person's autonomy. The God Emperor's sacrifice was the sacrifice of the consciousness whose transformation the sand-trout symbiosis produced. The sacrifice was the most comparable to the navigator's, was the biological transformation's sustained operation on the person the transformation encompassed, was the progressive modification of the body and the consciousness the sustained biological process generated. The comparison illuminated the choice's quality. Leto chose the transformation, made the autonomous decision the prescient consciousness's assessment informed, accepted the sacrifice's costs through the person's deliberate evaluation of the sacrifice's justification. The navigator's choice was informed but constrained, was the decision the institutional process's selection's context shaped, was the acceptance the institutional purposes framework's conditions influenced. The comparison also illuminated the duration. Leto's transformation was sustained for 3,500 years, was maintained across the millennia the Golden Path's governance required. The navigator's transformations were sustained for the decades and the centuries the individual navigator's operational lifetimes encompassed. Leto's duration exceeded the navigator's, was the longer sacrifice, the more sustained commitment, the more enduring personal cost. The exceedance was the comparison's most consequential dimension. Leto's sacrifice was longer. Leto's sacrifice was also chosen. The longer and the chosen were both the comparison's dimensions, were both the qualities the Leto Navigator comparison encompassed. The Navigator's sacrifice was shorter but more ambiguously chosen. Leto's sacrifice was longer but more clearly chosen. The duration and the choice were the comparison's two axes. The dimensions the comparison assessed the sacrifices along, the navigator's relationship with their pre-transformation identity, was the relationship the saga's documentation suggested without fully rendering, the relationship between the consciousness the transformation had altered and the identity the pre-transformation existence had sustained. The identity persisted. The consciousness whose mode had been altered by the transformation, whose perceptual orientation had been shifted from the ordinary to the navigational, retained the memories the pre-transformation existence had produced. The memories were present, were accessible to the consciousness the transformation had altered, were available to the awareness the navigational mode encompassed. The memory's presence was the identity's persistence, was the continuity between the pre-transformation person and the post-transformation navigator that the memory's availability constituted. The continuity was the identity's thread, the connection between the person the navigator had been and the navigator the person had become. The thread was complicated by the consciousness's alteration. The memories that were present in the consciousness were present in the altered consciousness, were accessed through the navigational mode's perceptual orientation rather than through the ordinary mode's perceptual orientation. The access was different, was conducted through the altered awareness's framework rather than through the ordinary awareness's framework. The different access changed the memory's experiential character. The memories that were experienced through the ordinary consciousness's framework, that were accessed through the ordinary mode's perceptual orientation, were the memories whose experiential quality the ordinary consciousness's emotional engagement provided. The memories accessed through the navigational consciousness's framework, through the altered mode's perceptual orientation, were the memories whose experiential quality the altered consciousness's reduced emotional engagement produced. The reduced emotional engagement was the identity's complication. The memories were present. The memories were accessed differently. The different access produced the different experience. The different experience changed the memory's quality. The changed quality was the identity's modification, the alteration of the person's relationship with the person's past through the consciousness's altered engagement with the past's content. The modification was not the elimination. The identity was not destroyed by the transformation. The identity was altered, was modified by the consciousness's alteration, was changed by the perceptual orientation's shift, was complicated by the emotional engagement's reduction. The alteration maintained the continuity while changing the continuity's quality. The maintained but changed quality was the identity's sustained condition. The navigator who retained the memories, who maintained the continuity the memory's presence constituted, was the navigator whose identity was the maintained but changed identity the consciousness's alteration produced. The identity was there. The identity was different. The presence and the difference coexisted. The navigator's death was the death the transformation's sustained condition eventually produced. The biological termination the organism's modified physiology's operational limits determined. The death's cause was the biology's exhaustion. The organism whose physiology the transformation had modified, whose systems the sustained saturation had altered across the decades and the centuries the navigational operation encompassed, was the organism whose biological operations eventually reached the limits the modification's parameters encompassed. The limits were the biology's boundaries, the parameters beyond which the modified systems could not sustain the operations the continued functioning required. The exhaustion was progressive. The organism's biological operations approached the limits progressively, moved toward the boundaries across the navigational operation's sustained duration, progressed toward the parameter's edges through the cumulative effects the sustained saturation's ongoing biochemical operations generated. The progression was the biology's trajectory. The developmental path the modified organism traversed from the transformation's initiation through the sustained operation's duration toward the operation's termination. The termination was the death, the biology that reached the operational limits, whose system's exhaustion exceeded the system's compensating capabilities. Was the biology whose functioning ceased at the termination the limit's exceedance produced. The cessation was the death, was the organism's biological conclusion the exhaustion generated. The death occurred in the tank, the navigator whose existence had been conducted in the tank's atmospheric conditions, whose biological operations had been sustained by the tank's provision across the navigational operations duration, died in the tank the operations had been conducted from. The tank that had been the existence's environment was the death's location. The tank that had sustained the biology was the location the biology's cessation occurred in. The death was solitary. The navigator whose isolation the transformation had sustained across the navigational operations duration, whose social separation the tank's conditions had maintained, died in the isolation the existence had been conducted within. The death was not attended by the persons the pre-transformation existence's social life had encompassed, was not accompanied by the family, the friends, the social connections the pre-transformation relationships had included. The solitary death was the isolation's final expression, the transformation's sustained social cost expressed in the death's unaccompanied character. The person who had been isolated in life was isolated in death. The isolation was comprehensive, encompassed the existence's duration and the existence's termination, maintained the separation's character across the condition's entire temporal extent. The Guild managed the death. The institutional operations that had managed the navigator's condition across the navigational operations duration managed the condition's termination alongside the condition's maintenance. The management was institutional, was conducted through the organizational apparatus the Guild maintained for the navigational function's administrative operations. The management included the replacement. The navigator whose death terminated the navigational operation the navigator had conducted was replaced by the navigator whose transformation the institutional process had produced for the replacement's provision. The replacement was the management's operational response, the institutional apparatus's provision of the navigational function's continuation through the replacement the apparatus maintained. The replacement's provision was the institutional management's most consequential operational quality. The management that replaced the dead navigator with the transformed replacement was the management that sustained the navigational function's operation across the individual navigator's biological terminations. The function continued. The navigators did not. The function's continuation and the navigator's termination coexisted, were both the management's operational dimensions, were both the institutional apparatus's managed outcomes. The coexistence was the institutional purpose's expression. The institution existed for the function. The function required the navigators. The navigators were consumed by the function. The consumed navigators were replaced by the new navigators. The replacement sustained the function. The function continued. The institution continued. The navigators were consumed. The consumption's pattern was the institutional purpose's operational expression. The sustained, ongoing, indefinitely maintained consumption of the persons the function required through the replacement the institutional management provided. The pattern was the horror, was the institutional operation that consumed the persons for the function's continuation with the sustained, ongoing, indefinitely maintained consumption the operational pattern constituted. The horrifying transformation of Dune's Guild Navigators was the transformation whose examination this narrative has conducted across the dimensions the examination's comprehensiveness encompassed. The transformation was biological. The body was modified. The cranium expanded. The limbs atrophied. The skin changed. The form was converted from the recognizable human to the unrecognizable other. The biological dimension was the transformation's visible expression, the dimension the observation could detect, the quality the encounter could register. The transformation was psychological. The consciousness was altered. The perceptual orientation was shifted. The self was dissolved. The identity was modified. The psychological dimension was the transformation's experiential expression. The dimension the person inside the consciousness underwent, the quality the awareness inhabited. The transformation was social. The isolation was imposed. The relationships were severed. The communication was reduced. The contact was eliminated. The social dimension was the transformation's relational expression. The dimension the person's connections to the other persons were affected through. The quality the social life's character was converted by. The transformation was existential. The human experience was replaced. The walking, the touching, the eating, the seeing, the dimensions the ordinary human existence encompassed were converted into the dimensions the navigational existence constituted. The existential dimension was the transformation's comprehensive expression, the dimension that encompassed every other dimension's contributions into the transformation's total personal cost. The cost was the horror. The horror was not the body's modifications' visual drama. The horror was not the consciousness's alterations' psychological distress. The horror was the cost. The comprehensive, sustained, irreversible. Institutionally imposed cost the transformation extracted from the persons the transformation encompassed. The cost was paid, the navigation was sustained, the civilization was connected, the worlds were linked, the commerce flowed, the governance reached, the civilization functioned because the navigators paid the cost. The navigators paid the cost because the transformation consumed them. The transformation consumed them because the function required them. The function required them because the civilization depended on them. The civilization depended on them and did not see them. The not seeing was the civilization's moral condition. The civilization that depended on the navigators, that required the transformation's products for the civilization's connectivity, was the civilization that concealed the transformation's costs behind the institutional architecture's distances. The concealment was the civilization's moral failure. The failure was not the transformation. The failure was the concealment, the hiding of the costs the civilization's connectivity was purchased through, the obscuring of the persons the civilization's navigational function consumed. The narrative revealed what the civilization concealed. The narrative showed the transformation. The narrative documented the costs. The narrative rendered the persons. The showing was the narrative's moral act. The horrifying transformation of Dune's Guild Navigators, the persons inside the tanks, the bodies the spice changed, the consciousnesses the saturation altered, the identities the modification dissolved, the lives the function consumed. The civilization sailed on their sacrifice. The civilization did not look at the sacrifice. The narrative looked. The navigator's relationship with the spice's source ecology was the relationship the transformation's biological dependency created between the person inside the tank and the sandworm ecology on the desert world the person would never visit, the connection between the consumer and the ecology the consumer could not perceive through the tank's sealed conditions. The navigator was connected to Arrakis. The connection was biochemical, was created by the spice's consumption, was maintained by the addiction's physiological dependency, was sustained by the atmospheric provision the tank's conditions required. The connection was also invisible, was not perceivable through the tank's sealed atmosphere, was not detectable through the navigational consciousness's prescient orientation, was not accessible through the sensory channels the transformation's conditions permitted. The invisibility was the connection's most consequential quality. The navigator, who was biochemically connected to the desert ecology, whose biological survival depended on the substance the sandworm life cycle produced, was the navigator who could not perceive the ecology the connection depended on. The connection was present. The connection was invisible. The presence and the invisibility coexisted in the navigator's condition, were both dimensions of the relationship the transformation's biological dependency constituted. The coexistence was the dependency's personal expression. The person who depended on the substance, whose biological continuation required the substance's continued provision, was the person who was separated from the substance's source by the tank's conditions the transformation imposed. The dependency connected. The tank separated. The connection and the separation coexisted. The sandworms that produced the spice the navigator consumed were the organisms the navigator would never encounter. The creatures whose life cycle generated the substance the navigator's biology required, whose ecological operation maintained the conditions the substance's production depended on, were the creatures the navigator's sealed existence prevented the navigator from perceiving. The navigator consumed the creature's product. The navigator did not know the creatures. The consumption and the non-knowing coexisted. The non-knowing was the civilization's broader non-knowing reproduced in the navigator's personal dimension. The civilization consumed the spice without understanding the ecology. The navigator consumed the spice without perceiving the ecology. The civilization's institutional distance and the navigator's physical enclosure produced the same non-knowing, the same absence of the awareness the dependency's management required, the same gap between the consumption and the comprehension. The gap was the saga's ecological argument reproduced in the transformation's personal dimension. The argument said, the consumer who does not perceive the ecology cannot manage the dependency. The navigator who did not perceive the ecology could not manage the dependency. The non-perception and the non-management were connected, were the two consequences of the same separation the tank's conditions imposed. The navigator was the civilization's dependency made personal, was the person in whom the civilization's structural reliance on the substance was expressed through the individual's biological reliance on the same substance. The civilization depended on the spice for the navigational function. The navigator depended on the spice for the biological survival. The dependency was the same. The scale was different. The civilization's dependency encompassed the institutional dimension. The navigator's dependency encompassed the personal dimension. The institutional and the personal were the same dependency expressed at different scales. The transformation, as the addiction's ultimate expression, was the dimension that connected the navigator's condition to the spice addiction's broader presence in the civilization's populations, the dimension that demonstrated the addiction's most developed form through the transformation's biological comprehensiveness. The ordinary addiction was the ordinary consumer's condition. The person whose sustained spice consumption had established the physiological dependency the withdrawal's lethality sustained was the person whose addiction was the ordinary expression, the expression at the concentrations the ordinary consumption maintained, at the levels the dietary or the environmental exposure provided. the ordinary addiction was manageable. The ordinary consumer managed the addiction through the continued consumption, maintained the physiological condition the dependency required through the ongoing provision of the substance the dependency demanded. The management was the continued consumption. The continued consumption was the management. The navigator's addiction exceeded the ordinary. The concentrations the navigational function required, the levels the atmospheric saturation maintained for the prescient perception's sustained operation, were the concentrations that exceeded the ordinary addiction's parameters by the orders of magnitude the navigational function's demands imposed. The exceedance was the addiction's intensification. The elevation of the dependency's physiological character from the ordinary levels to the navigational levels the intensification produced. The intensification's effects were the transformation's effects. The biological modifications the sustained saturation generated, the body's modification, the consciousness's alteration, the person's comprehensive conversion, were the effects the addiction's intensified form produced. The transformation was the addiction at the concentrations the navigational function demanded, was the dependency expressed at the levels the ordinary addiction's parameters could not encompass. The identity between the transformation and the addiction was the dimension the institutional narrative tended to obscure. The institutional narrative said, the transformation is the navigational function's biological requirement. The identity said, the transformation is the addiction at the navigational concentrations. The institutional narrative and the identity described the same process through different frameworks. The institutional framework that emphasized the function's requirements and the pharmacological framework that emphasized the addiction's intensification. The different frameworks produced the different assessments. The institutional framework assessed the transformation as the function's cost, as the biological investment the navigational capabilities provision required. The pharmacological framework assessed the transformation as the addiction's consequence, as the physiological effect the substance's sustained consumption at the elevated concentrations produced. The two assessments were both accurate. The transformation was both the function's cost and the addiction's consequence. The duality was the transformation's character, was the quality that made the transformation simultaneously the institutional purposes investment and the pharmacological processes product. The duality complicated the ethical assessment. The transformation assessed as the function's cost was the transformation the institutional purpose could justify, the investment the navigational capabilities provision warranted. The transformation assessed as the addiction's consequence was the transformation the pharmacological process could not justify, the effect the substance's elevated consumption produced regardless of the consumption's institutional purpose. The complication was the ethical assessment's most consequential quality. The transformation could not be assessed through either framework alone. The transformation required both frameworks, required the institutional assessment's evaluation of the function's cost alongside the pharmacological assessment's evaluation of the addiction's consequence. The both frameworks' evaluation was the transformation's comprehensive ethical assessment, the assessment that encompassed the transformation's dual character in the evaluation's combined consideration. The navigators and the Ixian navigation machine's relationship was the relationship that connected the transformation's personal costs to the technological alternative's potential provision of the navigational function, without the personal costs the transformation imposed. The machines were the alternative. The Ixian engineering tradition's development of the mechanical navigation, the technological provision of the navigational function through the engineered devices rather than through the transformed persons, was the development whose completion would have eliminated the transformation's necessity for the navigational function's provision. The elimination would have been the transformation's most consequential institutional change, the transformation that was necessary, that was required by the navigational function's biological provision, would have become unnecessary. The persons who were transformed, who were consumed by the transformation the function's biological provision demanded, would no longer need to be consumed. The consumption would cease. The persons would be preserved. The transformation would become the historical condition rather than the ongoing practice. The machine's availability would have saved the future navigators. The persons who would have been selected, whose candidacies the institutional process's selection would have identified, would not have been selected. The persons who would have been transformed, whose biology the initiation's process would have modified, would not have been transformed. The persons would have been preserved in the ordinary human condition the selection's absence permitted. The preservation would have been the machine's most consequential personal product. The saving of the persons the transformation would have consumed through the provision of the alternative that technological development made available. The saving was the machine's ethical contribution, the moral quality the alternative's availability introduced into the navigational function's institutional assessment. The machine's availability would not have saved the existing navigators. The persons who had been transformed, whose biology the sustained saturation had irreversibly modified, could not be restored to the pre-transformation condition the machine's availability made unnecessary. The irreversibility that characterized the transformation characterized the existing navigator's condition alongside the transformation's biological dimension. The machines could prevent the future transformations. The machines could not reverse the past transformations. The non-reversibility was the existing navigator's most consequential condition in the machine's availability's context. The persons whose transformation the machine's availability made unnecessary were the persons whose transformation the machine's availability could not undo. The persons remained in the tanks. The persons remained in the condition. The condition's permanence exceeded the institutional purpose's modification. The permanence was the transformation's final personal quality in the technological alternative's context. The persons who were transformed before the machine's availability, whose condition preceded the alternative's provision, were the persons whose condition was the condition the alternative could not address. The persons remained. The condition remained. The permanence was the condition's character, regardless of the alternative's availability. The transformation's place in the saga's argument about the human cost of civilization was the place the navigator's condition occupied in the saga's sustained examination of what the civilization cost the persons the civilization encompassed. The argument said, civilization costs persons. The civilization's institutional operations, the functions the institutions maintain, the services the institutions provide, the capabilities the institutions sustain, are the operations whose provision extracts the costs the persons the operations encompass must bear. The costs are personal, are borne by the persons rather than by the institutions, are experienced by the individuals rather than by the organizations. The navigators were the argument's most dramatic case. The persons whose transformation the navigational function consumed, whose bodies and whose consciousnesses the function's biological provision modified, were the persons whose personal costs the argument's examination documented with the sustained attention the cost's significance required. The documentation was the argument's method. The argument did not declare the costs. The argument showed the costs, rendered the transformation's personal dimensions with the narrative detail the dimension's comprehensiveness demanded, documented the condition's biological, psychological, social, and existential dimensions with the sustained attention the dimension's significance required. The showing was the narrative's moral quality. The narrative that showed the costs, that documented the transformation's personal dimensions rather than abstracting the transformation's institutional function, was the narrative whose moral quality the showing constituted. The showing was the attention. The attention was the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was the moral act the civilization's institutional architecture's concealment prevented. The moral act was the narrative's contribution to the civilization's moral account, the account that did not include the transformation's personal costs, that concealed the costs behind the institutional architecture's distances, was the account the narrative corrected through the costs documentation. The correction was the narrative's moral function, the performance of the acknowledgement the civilization's concealment prevented. The function was the argument's purpose. The argument's purpose was not the condemnation, was not the declaration that the civilization was wrong for consuming the persons the navigational function required. The argument's purpose was the acknowledgement, the recognition that the consumption occurred, the perception that the costs were borne, the awareness that the persons were consumed. The acknowledgement was the argument's moral gift. The gift was given to the reader, was presented to the consciousness that encountered the argument's documentation through the narrative's rendering. The consciousness that received the gift was the consciousness whose awareness was expanded by the acknowledgement, whose perception of the civilization's costs was enhanced by the documentation the narrative provided. The enhanced awareness was the argument's purpose fulfilled. The consciousness that was aware, that perceived the costs the civilization's architecture concealed, was the consciousness the argument was designed to produce. The production was the purpose. The purpose was the awareness. The awareness was the gift. The horrifying transformation of Dune's Guild Navigators, the transformation that was necessary, the transformation that was irreversible, the transformation that was sustained, the transformation that consumed the persons for the function the civilization required. The persons were consumed. The civilization was sustained. The consumption was concealed. The narrative revealed. The revelation was the moral act. The act was the narrative's purpose. The purpose was the awareness. The awareness was the reader's. Somewhere inside a navigation tank, inside the sealed chamber filled with the orange spice gas whose concentration would have killed an unmodified human in minutes, there was a person. There had been a person. The person was consumed. The function continued. The civilization sailed on.